I was standing in the hallway with a glass of water in my hand when I heard my son's voice drift through the half-closed kitchen door. "She is too old to care," Daniel told his wife, and Courtney gave a soft little laugh that made my stomach turn cold. "By tomorrow morning it'll all be done," he added. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not because I feared losing money, but because I finally understood my own son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. If this opening already touched a nerve, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And please tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you overheard your own child say something like that? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. My name is Norma Ward, and at 68 years old, I had already buried one great love survived, one season of grief so deep it felt like a second skin, and learned how quiet a house could become after the man who filled it with laughter was gone. My husband Frank had been dead for 4 years by then. 4 years since the casseroles stopped arriving. 4 years since the sympathy cards dried up. 4 years since everyone assumed the worst had passed, as if grief were a storm you simply waited out. But grief does not leave all at once. It changes shape. It folds itself into the corners of your home, sits in your favorite chair, and waits for you in the silence between one ordinary chore and the next. Frank and I had spent nearly 40 years in that house in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was not flashy. It was not the biggest on the block. But it was ours. The porch railing had been repainted 3 times. The kitchen cabinet still held the tiny scratch on the inside door where Daniel had once slammed a spoon when he was 7, and furious that I would not let him eat ice cream before dinner. The hallway wall had been patched after Frank backed a bookshelf into it one Christmas because he insisted he could rearrange the den by himself. Every room in that house carried a memory, and every memory carried some version of the people we had once been. For most of my life, I believed that if you built a home with enough love, the people inside it would know how to honor it. That was the first lie I ever told myself and truly believed. Daniel was my only child. He was 41 when he moved back into my home with his wife Courtney and their daughter Ellie. If you had asked me 10 years earlier whether I ever imagined my grown son would be living under my roof again, I would have smiled and said no. Daniel had always been charming, bright, quick with words. He had that easy grin, Frank used to say, could get him out of almost anything, and for many years it did. When he was younger, people liked him. Teachers excused him. Employers gave him second chances. Women found him persuasive. Even when he disappointed you, he had a way of making his regret sound so sincere that you wanted to believe him. As his mother, I did not just want to believe him. I needed to. So when Daniel called me one rainy Thursday afternoon, 18 months before that terrible night in the hallway, I heard the strain in his voice before he even finished saying hello. "Mom," he said, "things are tight right now. Just for a little while." That was how it started. Not with a demand. Not with disrespect. With weariness. With a son sounding smaller than he was. His consulting business, which he had spoken about for years with the inflated confidence of a man trying to stay one step ahead of his own reality, had run into trouble. A contract fell through, then another. A partner backed out. A client payment was delayed. There was always a reason, always a complication, always one more obstacle standing between Daniel and the successful life he believed he deserved. Courtney framed it differently. She said they had hit a rough patch. She said the apartment lease was ending at the worst possible time. She said Ellie needed stability. She said it would only be for a few months, just until they got back on their feet. I still remember standing in my kitchen while she said all this, her voice smooth and careful hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I had made for her. Her hair was perfectly blown out. Her pale pink nails looked too polished for a woman in true desperation. But I pushed that thought away the moment it surfaced. Women cope differently, I told myself. Appearance means nothing. Do not become suspicious just because someone carries crisis better than you would. Family helps family, I said. And that was that. They moved in the next weekend. At first I tried to see it as a blessing in disguise. The house felt less lonely with Ellie's backpack on the mudroom bench and voices drifting through the kitchen again. I could hear the television from the den in the evenings. There were shoes by the door, cereal bowls left near the sink, laundry waiting in baskets. Life had returned to the rooms. Not the life Frank and I had built, but life all the same. I told myself I was lucky. I did not charge them rent. I said it was temporary, and I meant it. I covered the electric bill when it rose. I bought extra groceries without mentioning the cost. When Courtney quietly admitted Ellie's tuition payment schedule had become complicated, I wrote the check myself because there was no child in this world who deserved to feel the consequences of adults failing around her. When Daniel's car insurance nearly lapsed, I paid that too. Once, when he came to me with tears in his eyes and said one credit card company was threatening legal action over a balance he had fallen behind on, I moved money out of my personal savings and covered it before the deadline. Just until I stabilize, he said. That phrase became the wallpaper of our life. Just until I stabilize. Just until this contract clears. Just until the market turns. Just until the next quarter. Just until women my age know how dangerous those words can be. Just until has a way of stretching itself into years if love keeps feeding it. And I fed it. Part of that was because I loved my son. Part of it was because Frank was gone and helping Daniel gave me somewhere to put all the care I no longer had a husband to spend on. Part of it, if I am being honest, was pride. I had survived widowhood. I had kept the house. I had managed the bills. I had not become one of those women who crumble the moment the paperwork gets complicated. Helping my son made me feel useful, needed, still central to somebody's life. But somewhere over that first year, tiny things began to snag at me. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I could point to in a single sentence and say, there. That is when I should have known. A bank envelope I remembered setting on the hall table disappeared before I opened it. Courtney said she must have placed it with the other mail and forgotten where. Daniel laughed and told me I needed a better system. A week later, I got a text with a security code for one of my online accounts, even though I had not tried to log in. Daniel, who was standing near me at the kitchen counter, glanced at my phone faster than felt natural and said, "Spam, probably. I get weird ones too." Another time, Courtney asked me in that sweet, interested tone she used when she wanted information, without making it sound like a question whether Frank had left everything super simple for me or whether there were trust things and legal stuff I still had to sort through. I remember looking up from my tea and saying Frank made sure I was taken care of. She smiled. "That's wonderful. I just worry about how overwhelming all that can be later in life." Later in life. I should have hated those words more than I did. Daniel started saying similar things, though always dressed in concern. If I mentioned balancing my accounts, he would say, "You really shouldn't stress over all that on your own, Mom." If I said I was driving across town to meet with my insurance agent, he'd answer, "At your age, dealing with all those details has to be exhausting." If I forgot where I set my reading glasses, which every human being on earth does, eventually he would exchange a glance with Courtney so quick it almost vanished, but not quickly enough. It is a terrible thing to feel yourself being watched for weakness inside your own home. And yet, because I had raised him, because I had changed his diapers, and sat through his fevers and held him after his first heartbreak, and watched him stand at his father's graveside with tears running down his face, I kept translating every discomfort into something kinder. He's stressed. They're embarrassed. It must be hard for a grown man to need his mother this much. That is what women like me do when love and denial braid themselves together. We become interpreters for the people hurting us. Still, there was one thing Daniel never understood about me, and maybe that was Frank's fault. Or maybe it was mine. My husband had been a good man, but he had also been a man of his generation. In public, people assumed he handled our financial life because he spoke louder, shook hands firmer, and wore confidence like a tailored jacket. Frank never corrected them, unless it mattered. He saw the amusement in my eyes and let the world keep its assumptions. The truth was that I had always been the one who remembered due dates tracked, balances compared policies, reviewed statements, noticed discrepancies, and asked the questions nobody else thought to ask. Frank handled plenty, but I handled more than Daniel ever knew. When Frank got sick in the last years of his life, that division became even clearer. I stepped fully into the practical side of survival, while Daniel floated in and out with sympathy casseroles and promises that faded when real responsibility appeared. I do not think my son ever truly saw me. He saw a mother. He saw comfort. He saw backup. He saw the woman who would answer the phone, open the front door, write the check, keep the peace, and explain away whatever should have been faced head-on. What he did not see was the woman who had quietly learned every line of every statement, every password structure, every clause of every policy, every path money could take if someone dishonest tried to move it. And because he did not see her, he made the mistake men like Daniel often make. He mistook softness for blindness. By the time I stood in that dark hallway with the cold glass trembling in my hand, hearing my own son tell his wife I was too old to care, the truth had already been creeping toward me for months. I simply had not let myself name it yet. But once a thing is named, it is impossible to unsee. And that night, for the first time, I began to understand that the danger inside my home was not financial hardship. It was entitlement wearing my son's face. Looking back now, I can see that Daniel and Courtney did not rush me. That was part of what made them dangerous. People think betrayal always arrives wearing urgency. They imagine slammed doors, raised voices, obvious demands. But the kind that enters through family often comes softly. It sits at your kitchen table. It offers to help. It notices where you keep your spare keys. It learns your routines while smiling at you over coffee. That was how they did it. The first time Daniel offered to help with my online banking, he made it sound almost embarrassing for him to ask. "Mom, I know you've handled your own stuff forever," he said one afternoon while I was sorting prescription receipts at the dining room table. "But some of these platforms change all the time. Security updates, weird login screens, scam warnings. I just don't want you getting locked out of something because they moved a button." I remember laughing lightly and saying, "I think I can still find a button on a screen." He smiled, but there was something in his expression that did not reach his eyes. "I know. I'm just saying if you ever want me to set things up in a way that's easier, I can." At the time, I heard concern. Now I hear reconnaissance. A week later, Courtney started her own version. She had a talent for making intrusion sound like generosity. She would drift into a room with that polished, effortless air of hers carrying a basket or notepad and say things like, "Norma, I noticed your file drawer is getting a little full. Would you like me to help you reorganize the insurance papers, or I'm doing a clean sweep of the kitchen junk drawer? Do you want me to sort through the envelopes and old receipts on the counter too?" Everything was always framed as a burden she was willing to lift for me. I let her help more than I should have. At first it was ordinary enough. She labeled folders. She stacked old statements. She made a show of admiring how together I was for someone my age, which should have insulted me more than it did. But flattery is tricky. It can sound like respect if you are lonely enough to want harmony. The trouble was not any single act. It was the pattern. Courtney wanted to know where things were. Which drawer held my legal papers? Which cabinet I used for tax records? Whether Frank had left a trust? Whether the house was already protected from probate complications? She never asked in a crude way. She asked like a woman trying to learn from her elder, like someone interested in being responsible. And Daniel, little by little, began echoing the same tune. "You shouldn't have to deal with all this alone. Let me make it simpler for you. At some point, you may want someone else to have easier access in case of an emergency." That last phrase should have stopped me cold. In case of an emergency. Women of my generation have survived enough to know that some people use emergency as a door they hope you will be too scared to close. What made it harder was that Daniel knew exactly which memories to touch when he wanted to lower my guard. One evening he sat beside me in the den, elbows on his knees, voice low and tired. "Do you remember when Dad was in the hospital that last winter?" he asked. Of course I remembered. I remembered everything about that winter. The smell of antiseptic on Frank's clothes when he came home between treatments. The way sunlight looked cruel on the kitchen floor because it kept shining on a life that was shrinking. The folder of unpaid bills I refused to look at until midnight because grief had to wait until paperwork was finished. Daniel shook his head slowly. That was the first time I realized how fast things can happen. If something ever happened to you, I wouldn't even know where to begin. That was not entirely untrue. During one stretch of Frank's illness, I had given Daniel limited access to one old household account so he could pay a few urgent bills while I was at the hospital. He had transferred money to the utility company, covered a pharmacy charge, and once mailed a late mortgage check I had nearly forgotten in the blur of those weeks. Back then, his help had felt like love. After Frank died, I meant to revisit all of that and clean up every leftover permission, every linked convenience, every account that had been opened for a temporary reason during a permanent heartbreak. But grief makes administrators out of some women and ghosts out of others. I was a little of both. I handled the major things, I met with the attorney, I updated the deed structure, I reviewed insurance, I changed what felt urgent. But certain old digital pathways remained in place because they belonged to a season I did not want to relive line by line. That was my mistake. Not ignorance, fatigue. And Daniel had remembered. Over the months after they moved in, I noticed small oddities I kept explaining away. One afternoon, I sat down at my desk to find the stack of financial mail I usually kept in date order had been shifted. Not missing exactly, just touched. I knew because I have always had the kind of memory built on habits. I place envelopes by size, statements on the left, medical notices on the right, a pension update tucked under correspondence requiring action. It looked insignificant to anyone else. To me, it looked like hands had been there. When I asked Courtney if she had moved anything while dusting, she gave a soft laugh. Oh, maybe. I was just trying to straighten up. You're so organized that I probably made it worse. Then she smiled and added, you know me, always trying to be useful. Useful. That word started sounding dangerous in my own house. Then there were the dinners. I do not think I will ever forget the Sunday evening Daniel corrected me in front of Courtney and Ellie over something so minor it should never have mattered. We were eating roast chicken at the kitchen table. I mentioned that my property tax estimate looked slightly higher than expected and that I planned to call the county office Monday morning to confirm whether the reassessment had gone through. Daniel cut into his chicken and said, Mom, we talked about that already. It's not due yet. I looked up. I didn't say it was due. I said the estimate changed. He gave me a patient little smile, the kind people use with children who have made an error in public. No, you were worried it had to be paid right away. I wasn't, I said quietly. Courtney took a sip of tea and said, it's okay. These things get confusing. There are so many different notices. I felt the room tilt in a way nobody else seemed to notice. Not because they were yelling, because they were rehearsing something, a version of me, a softer, blurrier, less reliable version. Ellie looked from one face to the other, her fork motionless in her hand. I remember saying nothing after that. I finished my meal. I cleared my plate. I stood at the sink washing dishes while my heart beat too hard for a conversation about taxes. That was the first time I let myself think a thought I did not want to think. They are trying to make me doubt myself. Still, even then, I resisted naming it fully. Love does that, especially a mother's love. It makes truth feel like betrayal if the truth is about your own child. A few days later, Daniel asked whether I had ever considered consolidating some of the old stuff to make things simpler. What old stuff, I asked. He shrugged. The little accounts, the legacy setups, anything still floating around from Dad's medical period. If there are old linkages or automatic transfers you don't even use, those are the kinds of things scammers prey on. He was watching me closely when he said it. That was what finally unsettled me more than the words themselves. He was not speaking casually. He was fishing to see what I knew. I answered lightly. I review my accounts often enough. He nodded too quickly. Good. That's good. Then after a pause he added, I just don't want you overwhelmed. At your age, one mistake online can snowball fast. At your age, there it was again. That phrase he kept using like a tiny knife wrapped in cotton. The truth was, I was not overwhelmed. I was observant. I was beginning to notice how often concern arrived right before questions, how often assistance drifted toward access, how often kindness seemed to circle paperwork, passwords, signatures, and legal language. And beneath all of it was the old account, the one from Frank's hospital winter. What Daniel did not know was that I had thought about it more than once in the past year. Not enough to act, but enough to feel the vague discomfort of an unfinished lock on a door I rarely opened. It was an old household account with limited functions, yet some of the authentication history and linked structures had never been fully dismantled after the crisis years. Nothing major, I told myself. Nothing dangerous, I told myself. But danger does not need a wide-open gate. Sometimes it only needs a forgotten hinge. By the time I stood in that hallway listening to Daniel tell Courtney I was too old to care, I finally understood what all those months had been, not random disrespect, not temporary stress, not generational impatience. It had been a slow campaign. They had been mapping my blind spots, testing my memory, studying my routines, and waiting for the right moment to move through a door I had once opened out of trust. And the worst part, the part that still hurts when I let myself sit with it, is that the door had not been opened by weakness. It had been opened by love. I did not confront them that night. That is the first thing people always get wrong when they imagine stories like mine. They think the moment of discovery must be followed by shouting accusation, tears spilling across a kitchen floor. But when the truth finally rose up in front of me, clear and ugly and impossible to explain away, I did not become louder, I became still. There is a kind of stillness that comes over a woman when she realizes emotion is the very thing being counted on to weaken her. It is not calm exactly. It is more like a bridge forming between pain and action. I stood in that hallway for several seconds after Daniel's voice faded. My hand had gone cold around the glass of water, and I could hear Courtney moving a chair in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. The sound was so ordinary it almost made me dizzy. I remember thinking absurdly that I should set the glass down before I dropped it on the hardwood floor and gave myself away. So I turned slowly and walked back to my bedroom. I closed the door without a sound. Only then did I let myself breathe. My room still looked the way Frank had left it in spirit, if not in exact arrangement. His side of the dresser held the wooden valet tray. I could never quite bring myself to move, even though it had been empty for years. A framed photograph of us at the Outer Banks sat near the lamp, Frank sunburned, smiling too wide, me squinting into the wind like I did not yet know how quickly whole decades disappear. The bedspread was folded back on one side where I had been reading earlier. A soft yellow pool of light from the bedside lamp made the room feel smaller than it was safer than it truly had become. I set the glass on the nightstand, then sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both palms flat against the quilt. My heart was pounding, but not in the scattered way it had during grief. This felt sharper, more precise, like fear that had found a shape. By tomorrow morning it'll all be done. Daniel's words kept circling in my head. Not we'll talk to her tomorrow. Not we'll ask. Done. Something had already been put in motion. That was when I looked across the room toward the back of my closet to the floor beneath the hanging winter coats and garment bags I only touched when the seasons turned. Behind 2 storage boxes and an old suitcase sat a dark brown leather portfolio Frank had bought years earlier. It was wide-worn at the corners and almost comically serious-looking, the kind of thing an old-fashioned banker or trial lawyer might have carried in the 80s. Frank used to joke that it made him look more important than he was, but near the end of his illness he had handed it to me one afternoon while sunlight striped the hospital blanket across his legs. If anything ever feels wrong, he had said, not confusing wrong, open this before you panic. At the time, I thought he was talking about widowhood, paperwork, accounts, the 1,000 blunt little bureaucracies death leaves behind. I had not understood that sometimes danger arrives before the funeral casseroles stop. I crossed the room and pulled the portfolio free. Even before I opened it, I felt something in me shift. Not because I expected magic inside. Frank had not left me secret fortunes or dramatic letters. He had left structure. He knew me well enough to understand that when I was frightened, information steadied me more than comfort ever could. The latch gave a soft metallic click. Inside were tabbed folders neatly labeled in Frank's blocky handwriting and then later updated in mine. Account summaries, contact sheets, copies of the trust framework, insurance policies, estate planning notes. A short list of institutions with direct numbers, not the public customer service lines, but the ones you reach after decades of being known. There was also a yellow envelope folded over twice with my name written across the front. Norma. Just that. I opened it with unsteady fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a note written in Frank's hand from the last year of his life. If you are reading this because something feels off, trust that feeling. Do not let kindness talk you out of caution. People rarely steal all at once. They test what they can move, what they can reach, what you will excuse. Start with the accounts, then call Patricia, then call Raymond. In that order. And don't tell anyone what you know until you know enough. I had to close my eyes after reading it. For one aching second, all I could feel was the loss of him. Frank had known me so completely that even now, years after his death, he was reaching forward to steady my hand. I put the note to my lips before I could stop myself, then laid it carefully beside me on the bed. Then I got up and pulled my old laptop from the bottom drawer of my dresser. Daniel did not know I still used it. That was partly because he had once laughed at how slow it was, and partly because I liked having one device in the house that belonged entirely to me. No shared streaming logins, no synced family calendars, no autofill memory anyone else might touch. It was not elegant, but it was mine. When I powered it on, the machine hummed awake with an almost stubborn reluctance. I sat at my desk, the portfolio open beside me, and waited for the login screen. My hands were steady by then. That surprised me. Maybe women my age are taught to think strength must look fearless. In my experience, strength often looks like terror that has accepted it does not have time to faint. I signed in and began exactly where Frank had told me to begin. The accounts. I did not check email first. I did not wander. I went straight into the banking and brokerage portals I used most, entering credentials from memory and verifying them through the secured backup methods I kept separate from my main phone whenever possible. As each screen opened, I moved slowly, carefully, letting my eyes settle before my mind started inventing explanations. The first two accounts looked normal, the third did not. There, on an older household banking structure I had not used actively in months, were pending actions set to process early the next morning. Transfers staged in amounts just low enough not to trigger the kind of dramatic flags people assume catch everything, but large enough to begin draining accessible liquidity if left alone. Not one giant theft. A sequence. Thoughtful, layered, quiet. My mouth went dry. I clicked deeper. There were recent authorization events tied to devices I did not recognize. Some had been accepted through authentication methods that should have required my approval. Others appeared to rely on previously established trust settings I had not reviewed closely enough in years. My pulse kicked once hard. I opened the security logs again and forced myself to read every line. 2 location pings matched our area. Home. Not abstract cybercrime. Not some faceless stranger in another state. Inside my house, I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. There is a particular kind of heartbreak in seeing betrayal translated into clean digital rows. No screaming, no twisted expression, just timestamps, device IDs, access confirmations, quiet proof that someone had been moving through the edges of your life while smiling at you over breakfast. I opened notification settings next. That was where Courtney appeared without her name appearing at all. Forwarding preferences had been altered months ago on one account, then adjusted again weeks later. Backup alerts no longer pointed only to my primary channels. Some had been rerouted through secondary paths I did not fully recognize at first glance. It took me several minutes to trace the pattern, and when I did, a chill ran through me so sharp it felt almost clean. She had been monitoring the doors while Daniel tested the locks. I checked another portal, then another. Not everything had been touched. That was almost worse. It meant they were being selective, careful, trying not to wake the whole house at once. I thought of all the small questions, the casual offers, the glances over my shoulder, the comments about stress and confusion, and how complicated things must be at my age. None of it had been random. They had not been waiting for me to become incapable. They had been trying to create conditions under which I could be treated as if I already were. I pressed one hand against my chest and stood up from the desk because sitting still suddenly felt impossible. I crossed the room, then turned and came back. The carpet beneath my feet was soft and familiar, but nothing in me felt sheltered anymore. By tomorrow morning it'll all be done. No, I thought, not if I reached morning first. That was the moment everything inside me clarified. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was not dealing with debt-strained relatives making bad choices in panic. I was not dealing with carelessness or laziness or immaturity that might still be excused by shame. I was dealing with intention, and intention required an answer. I went back to the desk, pulled Raymond Pike's direct number from the contact sheet, then Patricia Holloway's. I wrote both on a notepad beside the laptop, along with the time and the names of the affected accounts. I printed copies of the pending transaction summaries. I took photographs of the security screens with the old digital camera I kept in my drawer because I no longer trusted my phone as a single point of record. Then I looked once more at Frank's note. Start with the accounts, then call Patricia, then call Raymond, in that order. I smiled through the sting in my eyes. Still giving directions, I whispered. Outside my bedroom, the house was quiet now. Daniel and Courtney had gone upstairs to the guest room at the far end of the hall, probably satisfied that I was sleeping under the same roof as their plan. The refrigerator hummed faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a floorboard settled with the small sound old houses make at night, like a sigh through wood. Everything looked the same, but nothing was the same anymore. I sat back down, opened the first account again, and began preparing to move before dawn. I did not sleep. I thought I might at least for a few minutes, if only because the human body sometimes betrays the mind by shutting down when it is needed most. But sleep never came. The house felt too full of hidden movement, too full of breath I could not hear and intentions I now understood too well. So I stayed at my desk beneath the soft yellow lamp and watched the digital clock crawl toward dawn. At 4:02 a.m., I made the first call. Raymond Pike answered on the third ring with the gravelly alert voice of a man who had spent most of his life around numbers and bad news. Raymond Pike. Raymond, it's Norma Ward. There was a pause then, his tone changed immediately. Norma, is everything all right? No, I said. But I think I caught it before it finished. He did not waste time with vague sympathy. That was one of the reasons Frank had trusted him for so many years. Raymond understood that when people call before sunrise, they are not looking for comfort first. They are looking for competence. Tell me exactly what you're seeing, I told him. Every part I could say clearly. The queued transfers, the unfamiliar device authorizations, the altered notification paths, the old household structure that should have been cleaned up years earlier but never fully was. I expected him to sound shocked, maybe even doubtful. He did not. Instead, I heard the scratch of a pen against paper. All right, he said when I finished. First, do not touch anything you haven't documented. Second, I'm putting an immediate internal alert on the accounts we can reach from our side. Third, once the system day opens, I want you to authorize a freeze on every vulnerable access path tied to that older structure. We'll also revoke existing trusted devices and force fresh identity checks. I closed my eyes for 1 second in relief. Can we stop the transfers? If they're still pending, yes. If we move now. We worked through the first steps together, one by one. Raymond asked me to confirm account endings, access preferences, legacy permissions, and historical linkages. There were moments when I had to steady my voice, especially when we reached the old household account Daniel had once used during Frank's illness. That one should never have remained connected to anything substantial, I said quietly. Raymond answered with more kindness than I expected. Norma, grief leaves a lot of unfinished corners. That doesn't make you careless. I swallowed hard. Maybe not careless, I thought, but tired, trusting, slow to imagine my own son would reach for the hinges of a door I had opened in love. By 5:20 a.m., Raymond had done everything he could from his side before normal processing hours fully rolled into place. He promised to meet me at the branch later if needed, but first he urged me to call Patricia Holloway. Do that now, he said. And Norma, yes, do not discuss this with anyone in the house until your protections are in place. I won't. When I hung up, I sat still for only a moment before dialing Patricia. She answered more slowly, but she was awake enough to listen. Patricia had been our family attorney for years, though the word family had always felt a little too warm for what she actually did. She was precise, controlled, impossible to manipulate with tears, and blessed with the kind of legal mind that could hear 3 sentences and immediately begin building 10 moves ahead. Norma, she said, her voice low and slightly rough with sleep. What happened? I told her. Unlike Raymond, Patricia did let a beat of silence pass when I finished. Then she said, all right, listen carefully. I grabbed my pen again. Document every single step from this point forward. Times calls, screenshots, account numbers, what you found and when you found it. Do not delete anything. Do not accuse anyone yet. If there are identity-related concerns beyond the transfers, we may be moving from family misconduct into fraud exposure. That means we build before we confront fraud exposure. Hearing it phrased that way made the floor under my life feel colder. Patricia continued, you need to separate the emotional injury from the legal facts. I know that sounds harsh, but it matters. Right now, your son is not your son in the record. He is a possible actor with access and motive. Same for Courtney. I wrote down every word. She told me to gather copies of the account activity, all evidence of altered notification settings, and any documents or emails suggesting capacity-related inquiries or estate questions. She also told me something I did not expect. Norma, check your credit reports as soon as we secure the liquid assets. If they are bold enough to schedule transfers, they may also have tested your identity elsewhere. That sentence sent a deeper kind of fear through me. Money in an account is one thing. Money can be moved back, protected, traced. But identity, your name, your date of birth, your history, once that starts being used as a tool against you, it feels like someone has put their hands inside your life itself. By the time I ended the call, the first pale hint of morning had begun pressing against the edges of the curtains. I looked around my bedroom and felt for one brief second completely exhausted. I wanted Frank. I wanted the old version of motherhood where worry meant fever, broken hearts, or school trouble, not this. Not device logs and legal exposure and the knowledge that people I had fed, housed, and defended were sleeping comfortably down the hall while planning to move my life out from under me. But wanting did nothing. So I kept moving. I logged back into the accounts and followed Raymond's instructions exactly. I disabled secondary permissions where I could. I initiated security reviews. I locked down authentication routes. I re-established alerts to channels only I controlled. Then, with Raymond available by direct line as business systems opened, I approved the emergency freeze on the structures most exposed to the old linkage. The pending transfers stopped. I stared at the confirmation screen for a long time. Something in me did not feel triumphant. Not yet. Mostly I felt sick. Sick because I had been right. Sick because they would know soon. Sick because every click I made seemed to hammer one more nail into the coffin of the life I thought I had been living. Then came the next step, moving the liquid funds still vulnerable to older pathways into tighter channels Daniel could not see, touch, or imitate. That took time. Not because I didn't know what I was doing, but because I forced myself to double-check everything. Routing structures, access tiers, beneficiary frameworks, linked transfer permissions. I moved only what needed immediate protection, leaving careful records of every action so no one, not Daniel, not Courtney, not even some confused future relative could pretend I had acted recklessly. I had not stolen from my son. I had cut him off from what was never his. At 7:03 a.m., I finally opened the credit monitoring systems Patricia had mentioned. What I found there made my hands go cold all over again. There were soft inquiries I did not recognize. Nothing fully opened, not yet, but enough to tell a story. Someone had used pieces of my identity to explore lending pathways, temporary credit, possible extensions, financial products linked to my profile. Not a completed theft. A testing ground. A probing hand. That was when the truth sharpened from betrayal into something worse. Daniel and Courtney were not just trying to take advantage of my kindness, they were building a structure around me. A scaffold of access, permissions, assumptions, and narrative. If the transfers had gone through, they would have had money. If the identity channels opened further, they could have had reach. And if later they succeeded in painting me as confused or declining, they might have had a story to explain all of it. A story where they were not thieves. A story where they were caretakers. I pushed my chair back and stood, pressing both hands flat against the desk. "No," I said aloud into the empty room. The word came out calm, almost soft, but it carried more force than shouting ever could. "No, not my home, not my name, not my life." Outside, I heard movement at last. A floorboard in the upstairs hall. Water running in the guest bathroom. A cabinet door in the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of morning beginning. They had no idea yet, and that more than anything steadied me. For the first time since I had overheard them, I understood one simple truth: I was ahead. Not forever, not safely, but enough. Enough to keep the damage from finishing. Enough to make them show their hands before they were ready. Enough to look into their faces at breakfast and know something they did not. I gathered the printed pages, slid them back into Frank's leather portfolio, and tucked Patricia's notes into the yellow envelope beside his letter. Then I washed my face, brushed my hair, and changed into a clean blue blouse and cream slacks, the sort of outfit I wore to church luncheons or bank appointments, clothes that reminded me I was still a woman with shape and dignity, not a shadow. Shuffling through my own house. When I came downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. Courtney stood at the counter in silk pajama pants, staring at her phone. Daniel was at the table, tapping his thumb against a coffee mug with the restless impatience of a man waiting for something he believes is already his. Neither of them looked up right away. And in that quiet, ordinary morning light, with the portfolio still warm under my arm and the truth sitting cold and clean inside my chest, I knew this was the last breakfast we would ever share, as if we were still a family. There are moments when a room changes before anyone speaks. That morning I felt it almost the second I stepped into the kitchen. The light was soft and pale through the window over the sink, the kind of ordinary morning light that usually makes everything seem gentler than it is. The coffee machine hummed. The toaster clicked. Courtney stood barefoot on the tile floor in pale satin sleepwear, one hand wrapped around her phone, the other frozen halfway to the sugar bowl. Daniel sat at the kitchen table in a gray t-shirt and lounge pants, his hair still messy from sleep, but his whole body already carried the tense, impatient air of a man expecting results. And then those results began arriving. Courtney's face changed first. It was subtle, just a quick tightening around the mouth, a blink too long, the kind of expression people make when something on a screen does not match the version of the day they had already planned in their head. She tapped again, then again. Daniel noticed. What he asked, still casual. Courtney didn't answer right away. She turned slightly away from me as if instinct alone told her not to let me see the screen, but she had already made the mistake of showing her face. "It's not going through," she murmured. He held out his hand for the phone. "What do you mean it's not going through?" She passed it to him. I moved toward the cabinet and took down my usual mug, not hurrying, not trembling, not giving them anything. If I had learned one thing over the years, it was that panic invites predators. Calm confuses them. Daniel stared at the screen, frowned, then swiped hard enough to make the gesture look angry. "That's not right," he said. He stood, walked 2 quick steps toward the island and opened his own banking app. His thumb moved faster now. Refresh. Back out. Log in again. Refresh. I poured coffee into my mug. The smell rose warm and familiar, and for one strange moment I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Betrayal, attempted theft, my whole life shifting under my feet, and there I was, standing in my own kitchen measuring cream the way I had. Every morning for 20 years. Courtney took a breath that shook at the edges. "Try the other one." Daniel did. His jaw tightened. He looked at her. "It's locked." "Locked, that's what it says." She stepped closer, voice dropping lower, more urgent. "That one too." He didn't answer, and that answer was enough. I sat down at the far end of the table with my coffee and folded one hand over the other in my lap. Neither of them had acknowledged me yet. Not really. I was still in their minds, part of the background. The old woman drinking coffee, the harmless body in the room. Then Daniel tried one of the cards from his wallet through the digital account portal. Declined. He stared. Courtney whispered, "No, no, no, no." He tried again. Same result. The kitchen went silent except for the refrigerator motor kicking on beneath the counter. At that exact moment, Ellie came in wearing her school uniform skirt and cardigan, her backpack hanging from one shoulder, her hair only half brushed. She stopped near the doorway immediately, sensing the tension in the room, the way children do before adults admit it exists. "Mom," she asked softly. Courtney turned too quickly. "Go get your shoes on." "I already did." "Then go check your lunch." Ellie looked from her mother to her father, then to me. Her eyes lingered on my face for half a second longer than usual. Maybe she saw something different there. Maybe I only imagine that now. But I remember the way her expression changed, confused, cautious, alert. Daniel set the phone down so hard against the countertop that the sound cracked through the room. "What the hell?" he muttered. That was when he finally looked at me. Not like a son looking at his mother, like a man scanning a room for the source of a problem. "Mom," he said, and there was something false and strained in the word. "Have you been doing something with the accounts?" I lifted my mug, took one slow sip, and set it down carefully before answering. "Yes." Courtney's head turned sharply toward me. Daniel stared. "What do you mean, yes?" I said. Meeting his eyes, I protected what belongs to me. No one moved. Ellie stood frozen near the refrigerator. Courtney found her voice first. "Norma, I'm sorry, I don't understand." Protected what from what I looked at her then? Really looked at her. The smooth hair, the polished nails, the expensive skin cream she somehow still found room for in a household she claimed was struggling. For months I had studied her expressions, trying to read kindness into them. That morning I no longer had to. "From unauthorized access," I said. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "Unauthorized, yes." His face changed at that. A flicker. Fast but unmistakable. Not confusion. Recognition. Then anger came in to cover it. "Mom, if this is about some technical glitch..." "It isn't." Courtney stepped in her tone, honeyed careful. "Norma, maybe something got flagged by mistake." These systems do weird things all the time. If you change settings without telling us, maybe you accidentally interrupted. Interrupted what I asked. That shut her up. Daniel folded his arms. You don't have to do this. I almost smiled. Do what? This performance. There it was. Not apology. Not fear for me. Not even a decent attempt at lying with compassion. Just resentment that I had moved first. Ellie shifted beside the refrigerator. Dad, he turned his head sharply. Go wait in the living room. She flinched. That sound, that tiny intake of breath from a child trying not to be in the way of adult ugliness went through me like a knife. Ellie can stay, I said quietly. Daniel looked back at me. No, she can't. I held his gaze. She's already here. For a second, I thought he might actually raise his voice. His neck had gone red and the muscle in his jaw kept jumping. But Courtney touched his arm lightly. Not to comfort him, to manage him. Daniel, she said under her breath. He exhaled hard through his nose and pulled out a chair, sitting down as though forcing himself to appear reasonable. Okay, he said. Fine. Let's just be adults about this. That phrase nearly turned my stomach. He leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees, and gave me the same expression he used to wear when he was younger and trying to talk his way out of consequences. Earnest, wounded. Almost offended that anyone could think badly of him. If you got spooked by something online, you should have come to me. Freezing access without warning affects all of us. All of us, I asked. Yes, all of us. We live here too. The words landed exactly the way they were meant to. Not gratitude, not humility, but claim. Courtney stepped closer and softened her voice. Norma, I know this has probably all felt overwhelming. Maybe we all should have communicated better. But there's no need to escalate. We can sit down with coffee and sort this out together. Sort this out together. As if they had not already sorted it out without me. As if the whole point had not been to move things before I noticed. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking, not with fear now, but with the effort of staying composed. I was awake last night, I said, long enough to see the pending transfers. Courtney's face went blank. Daniel's eyes sharpened. What transfers? The ones scheduled for this morning? He gave a short scoff, but it was badly timed too quick. You're mistaken. No, I said. I'm not. His voice rose half a step. Then show me. That almost made me laugh. There it was again, that assumption that he had the right to demand proof from me in my house about my own money, as if I were a confused witness to something only he could interpret. I leaned back in my chair. No. He stared at me. No. What I will tell you is this access has been revoked, devices have been removed, and the accounts connected to the old household structure are no longer available to anyone but me. Courtney pulled her hand away from Daniel's arm and crossed both arms over her chest. Norma, if you're accusing us of something, you need to be careful. I turned to her. I am being careful, much more careful than I should have been months ago. Ellie looked at her mother, then at me again. Her small face had gone pale. Daniel stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floor. This is unbelievable, he snapped. After everything we've been dealing with, after all the pressure we're under, you choose now to act paranoid. Paranoid. The word hung there. A test word, a setup word, the kind that does more than insult. It frames. I felt something inside me go cold and solid. This isn't paranoia, I said. It's correction. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out for a second. And in that silence, I saw it, the first true crack in him. Not guilt, not yet. Fear, not fear for me. Fear because the plan had failed. Courtney recovered faster than he did. She straightened, took a small breath, and tried one more mask. Norma, she said, you're upset. We all are. Maybe this morning isn't the time, no, I said, cutting across her softly. This morning is exactly the time. The kitchen went still again. Ellie's lunchbox sat open on the counter, forgotten. Daniel's untouched coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, a school bus passed slowly at the end of the street, bright yellow and absurdly normal against the quiet collapse of everything inside my home. Daniel looked at me then in a way I had never seen before in all his 41 years. Not as his mother, not as a soft place to fall, not even as an old woman to dismiss, but as an obstacle that had unexpectedly learned how to stand. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that whatever came next would be uglier than breakfast, because men like my son can survive shame. What they cannot bear is losing control. The strange thing about betrayal is that once it has shown its face even briefly, every word afterward sounds different. That morning after breakfast, the house did not explode the way people imagine these situations do. No dishes shattered. No one stormed dramatically out the front door. The violence, if that is what you want to call it, stayed beneath the surface. It moved through looks, pauses, tones, and the careful selection of words meant to wound without yet admitting guilt. Daniel left the kitchen first, saying he needed to make a call. Courtney stayed behind, wiping an already clean counter with a paper towel. She never seemed to stop moving in anxious moments. Ellie had gone to wait near the front door with her backpack small and quiet and much too alert for a 12-year-old on a school morning. I stood at the sink, rinsing my mug, though it was already nearly clean. I needed the motion. Needed something for my hands to do. Courtney was the one who spoke first. "You know he's under a lot of pressure," she said softly, still not looking at me. I placed the mug in the drying rack. Pressure doesn't schedule transfers out of my accounts. That made her stop wiping. For a second, the kitchen held its breath. Then she folded the damp paper towel in half, set it beside the sink, and finally turned toward me with a face composed into concern. "Norma, I think you may be misunderstanding what you saw." I leaned one hand against the counter and looked at her. "Then explain it." She hesitated. "Not long, but long enough. There are situations," she began carefully, "where Daniel moves money around temporarily to manage timing between bills. He's done that before. Maybe he was trying to stabilize something before discussing it with you." I almost admired the sentence. Almost. It was slippery in all the right places. No direct denial. No real admission. Just enough vagueness to imply practicality, as though what I had seen were merely the invisible work of a responsible man handling family logistics. "With my money?" I asked. "With family resources," she said. There it was. Not my money. Family resources. Language matters. It always has. The moment someone starts renaming what belongs to you, they are already halfway through taking it. I turned fully toward her. "This is not a family misunderstanding, Courtney. It is not a timing issue. And it is not a matter of shared resources. The accounts are mine. The permissions were abused. That is the truth." A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "You keep saying abused like there was malicious intent." I held her gaze. Was there? She looked down. That was answer enough. Before I could speak again, Daniel came back into the kitchen, moving fast, phone still in his hand, shoulders tight with anger he was barely containing. "The branch says the restrictions are real," he snapped. "They won't discuss anything with me." "Of course they won't," I said. He stared at me as though I had slapped him. "This is unbelievable." "No," I said quietly. "It's overdue." His eyes narrowed. "You're really going to do this?" I had noticed something over the years about Daniel's way of speaking when cornered. He rarely addressed the actual act in question. He preferred phrases like this, that everything, all this drama, words broad enough to avoid the specifics that might trap him. "What exactly am I doing?" I asked. He laughed once, sharp and angry. "You're humiliating me." The sentence landed harder than I expected, not because it was true, but because it told me so much. Not. "You're accusing me falsely." Not. "You're hurting the family." Not. "Even you don't understand. You're humiliating me." So that was the wound he felt first. Not what he had done. Not that I had discovered it. Not the possibility that his daughter had heard too much. His first wound was humiliation. I folded my arms across my chest, not defensively, but to hold myself steady. "If being stopped feels humiliating, Daniel, maybe you should ask yourself why." His face went red again. "I was trying to keep things afloat." With scheduled transfers out of my accounts before dawn, he stepped closer. "You don't know everything." "No," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt. "But I know enough." Courtney moved between us slightly, not enough to seem obvious, just enough to soften the scene if Ellie wandered back in. She placed a hand on Daniel's forearm and spoke in the careful tone of a woman trying to sound reasonable for an invisible jury. "Let's all take a breath. This doesn't have to become something ugly." I looked at her hand on his arm, the same hand that had held that phone at breakfast, the same hand that had reorganized. My files touched my mail, asked sweet questions about trusts and legal arrangements as if she were learning from me, instead of measuring me. "It already is ugly," I said. Daniel pulled his arm away from her and turned on me again. "Fine. Then let's stop pretending. Yes, I moved things around sometimes. Yes, I looked at options. Because somebody in this house had to think ahead. Somebody in this house. The sheer arrogance of it made my skin prickle. You mean while living here rent-free? I asked. His mouth tightened. That's not fair. Isn't it? Courtney stepped in quickly. Norma, you know how hard the last year has been. Yes, I said. I financed a great deal of it. Silence. Then Daniel said the thing I think he believed would make me retreat. You have no idea what kind of pressure I've been under. I looked at him for a long moment. I buried my husband, I said. I kept this house. I paid every bill you were too ashamed to mention until the last possible minute. I covered tuition so Ellie wouldn't feel the consequences of your instability. I paid your insurance. I paid your credit card. I opened my home. So don't stand in my kitchen and explain pressure to me like I'm a woman who has lived a light life. For 1 second, something in his face wavered. Not remorse. Recognition, maybe. The faintest memory that I had once been a real person to him and not merely a backup system. But it passed quickly. None of this would have happened, he said, if you trusted me. There it was, the inversion. The move people make when they know they have crossed a line and need you to feel guilty for noticing it. I almost answered immediately. Instead, I took a breath and asked the question that had been waiting in me since before sunrise. Why were there papers being explored about diminished capacity? Neither of them moved. The silence was so sudden and complete it rang in my ears. Courtney recovered first, but only barely. What are you talking about, don't? I said. My voice was quiet. That made it more powerful. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. Daniel's expression changed. Not to confusion. To calculation. Fast, cold calculation. I think he said slowly that somebody is feeding you nonsense. No, I said. Somebody has been feeding me nonsense for months. This morning is simply the first time I stopped swallowing it. He looked toward the hallway, toward the front door where Ellie was likely still waiting, then back at me. His voice dropped. Mom, listen to yourself. It was such a chilling sentence in that moment. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how practiced they sounded. Not angry, almost tender. The tone people use when introducing the idea that someone is not fully reliable. I felt something inside me turn to ice. That was the plan. Not just money, not just access. Narrative. If they could not move everything quietly, they could still prepare the story. Norma is confused. Norma is paranoid. Norma doesn't remember correctly. Norma needs help. Norma isn't safe managing things alone anymore. All the little corrections at dinner. All the comments about my age. All the glances when I misplaced my reading glasses. All the offers to simplify, organize, assist. They had not only been probing the accounts. They had been laying language like kindling around me, waiting for the right spark. I heard Patricia's voice in my memory from that dawn phone call, separate the emotional injury from the legal facts. So I did. I am listening to myself, I said. Very clearly. Which is why I know this conversation is over for now. Daniel blinked. For now, yes. Because I will not discuss legal exposure, financial misconduct, or any matter related to my capacity in an informal argument in my own kitchen. Courtney stared at me. I could see the shift in her then the moment she realized I was no longer reacting as a wounded mother but moving as someone building a record. Legal exposure, she repeated. Yes. Daniel gave a bitter, disbelieving laugh. You're going to make this legal. I looked at him and thought with a pain so old it felt almost ancient. You made it legal the moment you treated my life like an asset to be positioned. But what I said was simpler. No, Daniel, you did. He turned away and dragged both hands through his hair. Jesus Christ. I didn't answer. After a moment he faced me again, eyes darker now, voice flatter. You really think we were trying to put you away somewhere? The cruelty of that phrase, the mockery tucked inside it, told me more than any denial could have. I think I said carefully that inquiries were made that had nothing to do with helping me and everything to do with controlling me. Courtney opened her mouth, then closed it. And that was when I knew. The financial theft had been phase 1, quiet, deniable, practical. But phase 2 had always been worse. Not simply gaining money, gaining authority. Gaining the right to speak over me, around me, in place of me, turning me from a woman into a condition, from a person into a problem. I felt suddenly tired in a way sleep could never fix. Not weak, just tired to the bone. At the front of the house, I heard the school bus horn. Ellie's footsteps crossed the floor quickly. The front door opened, then shut. The sound went through me like grief. When I looked back at Daniel, I saw not just the man in my kitchen, but the little boy he had once been, and the terrible distance between that child and this stranger who thought my age made me easier to erase. And with that came the hardest realization yet. They did not just want my money, they wanted my place. After Daniel and Courtney left the kitchen that morning, I stood alone for a long time with one hand resting on the back of a chair. Frank had refinished himself nearly 20 years earlier. The house had gone quiet again, but it was not the quiet I used to know. This silence had edges. It pressed against my skin. I could hear Daniel pacing upstairs. Courtney opened and shut drawers in the guest room with more force than necessary. Now and then, a floorboard creaked, and every sound reminded me that the people moving through my home were no longer simply my family in crisis. They were people I had to protect myself from. That knowledge should have made me purely angry. Instead, what rose first was grief. Not the sharp, stunned grief I had felt in the hallway the night before. Not the icy clarity of dawn when I found the queued transfers. This was older grief, deeper grief, the kind that pulls roots up with it. It was the grief of looking backward and understanding that betrayal does not begin on the day you discover it. It begins in all the moments before when something was wrong and love persuaded you to rename it. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair Daniel had occupied at breakfast. I remembered him at 6, sitting in that same general spot at our old pine table before we remodeled the kitchen. His feet hadn't reached the floor back then. He used to swing them while eating cereal and ask endless questions in a voice still soft with childhood. Why do birds know where to go in winter? Why do grown-ups pay bills? Why does Grandpa snore louder in his chair than in bed? He had been a tender child once. People always want villains to emerge fully formed as if cruelty arrives complete. But most of the time it doesn't. It grows where something else should have matured. Daniel had been sensitive as a boy. He hated seeing people cry. When Frank worked late, Daniel would sit beside me on the couch and rest his head against my shoulder as if he already knew loneliness was a thing that could enter a room and sit down. When I had the flu one winter, he carried me a cup of orange juice with both small hands and looked so proud of himself I nearly cried. That is the son I remembered for years whenever the adult version of him disappointed me. And he did disappoint me. More often than I admitted. The first serious lie had come when he was 19 and away at college. He called Frank asking for money to cover textbooks, then used it to pay off a gambling debt to a roommate he swore had pressured him. Frank was furious. Daniel cried. I made excuses. He was young. He was embarrassed. College was stressful. Frank wanted consequences. I wanted compassion. In the end, compassion won. Then there was the bounced rent check at 26, the maxed-out credit card at 30, the temporary loan at 33, that was never repaid, but eventually folded silently into a family holiday so no one would have to. Say the word debt out loud. Each time, Daniel had a reason. Each time I found one for him, too. That is the part older women do not like to say aloud, especially mothers. Sometimes betrayal finds room to grow because we keep cushioning the floor beneath the person falling. We tell ourselves we are helping, and maybe in the beginning we are. But there is a line where help becomes insulation from consequence, and once someone learns that other people will absorb the cost of their choices, gratitude starts curdling into expectation. I had spent years mistaking Daniel's dependence for closeness. That realization sat in my chest like a stone. I got up and began clearing the breakfast things even though most of them had already been dealt with. Courtney's toast crust on a plate, Daniel's mug with a dried brown ring at the bottom, a knife left carelessly by the sink. I moved through the small tasks because movement helped me think. By the time I wiped the table, one truth had settled in me with painful steadiness. I had not caused Daniel's greed, but I had helped create the conditions in which he never had to fear it in himself. Frank used to say that some people do not change until life stops cushioning them. I always thought that sounded too hard, too unforgiving. Now I wondered if what I had called kindness all these years had sometimes just been fear of being the one who let my son suffer. The guilt of that realization was sharp enough to make me sit back down, because this was not only about money, not even mostly. It was about the humiliation of understanding that I had spent years protecting Daniel from discomfort while he had spent months studying how to turn my age into a weakness. Still, grief and guilt are luxuries when danger remains active. By late morning, Patricia called back with a steadier legal outline. I carried the phone into my bedroom and shut the door before answering. Her voice was clipped and focused. "I need you to continue documenting everything," she said. "And I want you to think beyond the banking issue now." "What do you mean?" "I mean home dynamics, language patterns, any evidence they have been setting up a narrative around your age, memory, independence, or health, especially if there have been repeated comments in front of witnesses." I sat at my desk and opened a notebook. "There have," I said, so I started listing them. The tax conversation at dinner. The remarks about me being overwhelmed. Daniel correcting things I had not actually gotten wrong. Courtney asking questions about long-term care and trusts in that polished voice of hers. The strange glances between them when I forgot ordinary things like where I set my glasses or whether I had already thawed chicken for dinner. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That matters." The words made me cold. "You really think they were building something? I think they were at minimum exploring options," she said. And when money is involved, people often prepare multiple routes. Financial access is one route. Capacity questions are another. The second becomes especially useful if the first is challenged. I looked down at the notebook page filled with my own handwriting and felt a wave of nausea. I had lived long enough to know that older women are often treated as half dismissible even when we are fully lucid. Forget one appointment, repeat one story, misplace one bill, and suddenly people begin speaking about you instead of to you. What Daniel and Courtney had been doing was not just opportunistic, it was cultural. They were leaning into a script the world was always ready to believe. Patricia continued, "You need to protect the house, too." The house, yes. Not only physically, practically. I want an inventory of key legal documents, any medication, any checkbooks, spare keys, and any records still accessible in common areas. I wrote it all down. Then she added, "And if you feel unsafe, install lawful surveillance in shared common spaces after we confirm the proper notice requirements." That sentence landed with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Relief, because there was something concrete I could do. Sorrow, because I had reached a point in life where I needed legal guidance to live safely under the same roof as my son. After I hung up, I began moving through the house more deliberately than I had in months. I checked the file drawer in the study. Some folders had clearly been touched. Not ravaged. Just shifted with enough care to avoid being obvious to anyone less habit-driven than I was. I gathered the most sensitive records, trust summaries, copies of the deed account, maps, tax documents, and carried them to my bedroom closet. I checked the kitchen drawer where I kept an old checkbook tied to a low-balance household account. It was there, but not in the position I normally kept it. Again, a small thing. Again, only visible if you had been paying attention. I looked at the lockbox in the linen closet, where I kept extra prescription information, passport copies, and a few emergency cash envelopes. Still locked, still present, but the stack of towels in front of it had been folded back differently than I remembered. Maybe I would have dismissed all of it a week earlier. Now I could not. By early afternoon, I called a local home security consultant Patricia recommended and arranged for legal common area cameras with proper notice under state law. I told myself it was about protection. That was true, but it was also about proof. I had crossed into a world where intuition was no longer enough. I would need evidence if things became uglier. As the day wore on, my mind kept returning to Ellie, 12 years old, bright, quiet, too observant for the household she had been raised in. I thought about the way she had stood near the refrigerator at breakfast, watching all of us with wide, careful eyes. Children notice more than adults like to believe, especially children who live inside unstable marriages and money troubles. They learn to read faces the way other kids read chapter books. I began thinking back over little things she had said in the past few months. Once she asked if I ever worried people could get in trouble for moving money around if it was still family. I had laughed lightly and asked what on earth that meant. She shrugged and said she'd heard something online. Another time she asked whether old people could be forced to live somewhere they didn't want to. I had assumed she meant a movie or school assignment. Now remembering it, my stomach tightened. By late afternoon, I no longer believed Ellie was simply witnessing stress. I believed she knew pieces of something, and if she knew pieces, then she had likely been carrying them alone. That thought hurt more than almost anything else that day, Because whatever else Daniel and Courtney had become, they were still her parents. And children love their parents even when those parents fill the air with fear. Especially then. I stood at the living room window as the light began to fade and watched the street beyond my yard settle into evening traffic. Somewhere in the house, Courtney was speaking in a low voice on the phone. Daniel opened the back door, stepped onto the patio, then shut it again harder than necessary. Every movement sounded charged. I placed one hand flat against the glass. I could feel it then with a certainty I had not allowed myself earlier. The worst of this was not over. The money had been protected, yes. The transfers had failed. Their first move had been stopped. But now the story would widen, and somewhere inside that widening story was a little girl who had likely seen too much, understood too little, and trusted no one with it yet. I turned from the window and whispered into the quiet room, "What have you heard, baby?" And for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew with absolute clarity that I was not only fighting to save myself, I was fighting to reach Ellie before her parents taught her that love and manipulation were the same thing. Ellie came to me that evening without meaning to. That is the only way I know how to say it, because I do not believe she had planned some brave confession in advance. Children rarely do. They circle the truth first. They test the ground. They ask one strange little question and wait to see whether the adult in front of them is safe enough to hear the rest. It was just after 7. Courtney had gone upstairs after a tense, sharp-edged phone call that ended with more silence than words. Daniel had taken his truck out and come back 20 minutes later angrier than before. The whole house felt swollen with things nobody wanted to say out loud. I was in the den pretending to read when Ellie appeared in the doorway in her socks holding the sleeve of her cardigan in one fist. Grandma, her voice was so soft I almost missed it. I looked up and set the book down immediately. "Come in, sweetheart." She stepped inside but did not sit right away. Instead, she stood near the edge of the rug, half in the light from the lamp and half in shadow, as if she had not yet decided whether she meant to stay. "What is it?" I asked gently. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, then back to me. "Are Mom and Dad mad because the money thing didn't work?" It felt as though all the air in the room had gone still, not because I was surprised that she knew something. By then I had begun to suspect it. But hearing it from her in that careful little voice made the whole thing more monstrous. Adults can dress greed up in all kinds of language when speaking to each other: pressure, timing, temporary, practical. But from a child's mouth stripped of all those disguises, it sounded exactly like what it was: the money thing. I kept my face as calm as I could. "Why would you ask me that?" I said. She looked down at her socks. "I just heard stuff." I patted the sofa cushion beside me. "Come sit with me." She hesitated, then crossed the room and perched on the far edge of the couch, too upright to be comfortable. I noticed then that her hair had been brushed carelessly, one section near the back still slightly tangled. Usually Courtney never let that happen. It struck me as one more sign that the adults in this house had become too occupied with themselves to see the child between them clearly. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Silence can be a gift when a child is deciding whether to trust you. After a moment, Ellie said, "They've been fighting a lot." "I know." She shook her head. "No, like, a lot. Something about the way she said it broke my heart. The smallness of her trying to measure chaos in words. "How long?" I asked. She shrugged. "Maybe weeks. Maybe more. Sometimes in the car. Sometimes after they think I'm asleep." She swallowed, and I could see she was trying very hard not to cry. I softened my voice even more. "You don't have to protect anybody right now, Ellie. You can just tell me what you remember." That did it. Not in a dramatic rush. Just enough for her shoulders to lower a fraction. "They kept talking about bills," she said. "And this condo. I don't know where. Somewhere with a pool, maybe. Mom showed Dad pictures one night. A condo. So that part had been real. What else?" Her fingers twisted in the hem of her skirt. "Dad said if they could just get through this part, everything would be different. And Mom said you wouldn't know until it was done." For one terrible second, I could not speak. I had heard that same confidence in Daniel's voice the night before. The assumption that I would simply wake up inside their finished plan too late to stop it. Ellie looked at me quickly as if afraid she had said something wrong. "I'm sorry." "No." I reached over and took her hand. "No, sweetheart. You have nothing to be sorry for." Her hand was cold. She took a shaky breath. One night they were in the kitchen and Dad said something about how it used to be easier when you forgot things more. I felt my spine stiffen. And Mom said Ellie continued slower, now searching for the exact words. Once she gets evaluated, this all goes faster. The room seemed to narrow around us. There it was. Not suspicion. Not a lawyer's inference. Not even a pattern I had built from fragments. A child had heard the sentence itself. Once she gets evaluated, this all goes faster. I closed my eyes for one heartbeat and opened them again. Did they say what evaluated meant? Ellie shook her head. I asked Mom later if somebody was sick, and she told me not to repeat grown-up conversations. Of course she did. A hot, bitter anger rose in me then, not only for what Daniel and Courtney had been planning, but for the burden they had placed on this little girl. Adults who use children as silent storage for their ugliness rarely understand the damage they do. A child does not forget the weight of overheard fear. It settles in the body. Have they ever said anything to you about me being confused? I asked. She nodded. How often? I don't know. A bunch. What did they say? Her answer came out in a rush, as if once the door opened, the words could no longer stay neatly lined up inside her. Dad said, you get mixed up more now and that we have to be patient, because getting older makes people difficult sometimes. And Mom said, you don't always understand financial stuff anymore, even if you think you do. But I didn't believe that, because you always know where everything is, and you help me with my science homework better than Dad does, and you remembered the exact date of my chorus concert when Mom forgot it, so I knew it wasn't. True, but I didn't know if I was supposed to say that. By the end of it, her face had gone pink with effort. I squeezed her hand. Oh, Ellie. That was all I could say at first. There are moments when your heart breaks in more than one direction at once. Mine broke for myself then, yes. For the insult, the scheme, the coldness of being studied like a failing machine in my own home. But it broke just as sharply for this child, who had been asked to absorb contradiction after contradiction. Love your parents, obey your parents, trust your parents, and quietly notice that they are lying. She looked at me with frightened eyes. Are they in trouble? I chose my next words carefully. They made very bad choices. Like illegal, children always go to the center of things faster than adults do. I did not answer right away. There are some things I'm going to have to handle with grown-up help. Her lower lip trembled. I don't want anybody to go to jail. Neither had I, not really. Even then, even after everything. That is one of the shames older mothers carry in secret. Sometimes mercy survives longer than it should. I moved closer and put an arm around her shoulders. At first she stiffened, then she folded into me suddenly, all wiry 12-year-old bones and bottled up fear. I held her the way I had held Daniel when he was her age and feverish, and the irony of that nearly undid me. You listen to me, I whispered into her hair. None of this is your fault. Not one bit of it. She nodded against me, but children nod before they believe things. I should have told you before, she said into my blouse. You tell me when you're ready. That's enough. No, because... She drew back and wiped under one eye with the heel of her hand. Because one time I heard Dad say, Grandma won't fight me on this. She never does. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into deep water. I had spent so many years telling myself that my softness kept the family together. Now I heard what he had learned from it. She never does. Not she forgives. Not she loves me. She never fights me. Ellie looked miserable. I thought maybe he was just mad. Maybe he was, I said softly. But being mad doesn't make what he did right. She picked at a loose thread on the cushion between us. Are you going to make them leave? There it was. The question beneath all the others. I looked toward the darkened hallway, toward the stairs where her parents moved above us like a pressure system waiting to break. I don't know exactly what will happen yet, I said, which was true enough to be honest. But I do know this. I am going to make sure you are safe. She looked up at me then with a seriousness that did not belong on a child's face. I don't like it when they whisper, she said. It means something bad is happening. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Then no more carrying whispers by yourself. If you hear something that scares you, you come to me. All right, she nodded. And if anybody tells you to choose between loving them and telling the truth, that is not fair to you. Grown-ups are supposed to protect children from problems like this, not hand them over. That was when she finally cried for real. Quiet tears, not dramatic ones. The kind that leak out after too much holding in. I gathered her into my arms again and let her cry against me while I stared over her shoulder into the dim room, my eyes fixed on nothing and everything all at once. I had known by then that Daniel and Courtney were willing to use me. That evening, sitting there with Ellie trembling in my arms, I understood something even worse. They had been willing to use her silence too. And in that moment, whatever remained in me of hesitation changed shape. I was no longer just protecting my accounts. I was no longer just defending my house. I was protecting one child from learning that family means enduring manipulation with a polite face and a closed mouth. I kissed the top of Ellie's head and held her tighter. No, I thought. Not if I can help it. Not this time. The next morning, the house felt like a place waiting for weather. No one said much over breakfast. Courtney moved around the kitchen with brittle efficiency, setting out toast for Ellie without looking at me. Daniel checked his phone every few minutes, his thumb working the screen with the angry repetition of a man trying to force reality to return to the shape he preferred. Ellie barely touched her cereal. I spoke only when necessary, and even then I kept my voice level. There are times when silence is not peace. It is positioning. By the time Ellie left for school, I already knew Daniel and Courtney were not going to step back quietly. People who have convinced themselves that someone else's life is part of their rescue plan rarely retreat because they are ashamed. They retreat only when the cost becomes too high. And Daniel had never been a man who accepted cost gracefully. He started before noon. I was in the study organizing copies of the account records Patricia had asked me to preserve when my sister Linda called. Linda Mercer had always been the kind of woman people underestimated until they needed someone who could look a storm in the face and call it by its proper name. She lived 20 minutes away, still wore lipstick to the grocery store, and had the irritating but useful habit of noticing what everyone else preferred to gloss over. "Norma," she said without preamble, "what exactly is going on in that house?" I sat back slowly in my chair. Why? A pause. Because Daniel just called me sounding wounded and righteous, which is never a combination I trust. Despite everything, a tired little breath almost left me as laughter. What did he say? He said, "You're under a lot of stress, things have gotten confused, and there was some sort of financial misunderstanding you've blown out of proportion." There it was. Not a misunderstanding. The beginning of a campaign. I closed my eyes for a second and pressed 2 fingers against my temple. Of course he did. Linda's voice sharpened. "Norma." So I told her. Not every detail. I was already learning to separate truth from strategy, but enough. The cued transfers. The unauthorized access. The manipulations around my age. The hints about evaluation. The fact that Patricia was involved. Linda listened in stunned silence. When I finished, she said only, "That boy has lost his damn mind." The bluntness of it nearly made me cry. Instead, I swallowed and said, "I need you to do something for me. Anything. If Daniel contacts relatives, if Courtney starts making this sound like I'm confused or unstable, I need you to remember this conversation exactly as we've had it. You think they're going to smear you?" I looked down at the notebook open in front of me. "I think they've already started." Linda did not hesitate. "Then let them come through me first." After I hung up, I sat motionless for a moment, listening to the house around me. Daniel was downstairs in the den on a phone call. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. She's not herself. All of a sudden, I'm trying to keep things calm. The ugliness of it settled over me with a different kind of weight than the financial betrayal had. Money can be traced, paper can be answered. But once someone starts trying to turn your own life into a story about your decline, the injury becomes more intimate. They are not just stealing resources then, they are stealing your credibility, your standing, your voice. I wrote down the time. 12:14 p.m. Overheard Daniel on phone implying, "I am not myself." Patricia had told me to document everything. So I did. At 1236, a cousin named Renee called. She spoke with awkward care, the way people do when they believe they are stepping into private pain, but also enjoy knowing something before everyone else. "Norma," she said. Daniel sounded worried. He said, "There's been some tension over the accounts and maybe you're feeling overwhelmed." I stared out the study window at the dogwood tree in the yard, its branches still bare from winter. "I am not overwhelmed, Renee," I said. "Oh, of course. I didn't mean I know what you meant." Silence. Then, because I could hear her uncertainty and because I had no energy left for soft evasions, I added, "If anyone contacts you suggesting I'm becoming confused, I want you to understand that legal counsel and financial documentation are already involved." That sobered her instantly. "Oh," she said. Then more quietly, "Oh." By mid-afternoon, 3 more calls had come in. Not all of them said the same thing, but the pattern was unmistakable. Concern, caution, questions wrapped in sympathy. Had I been sleeping enough? Had grief maybe caught up with me? Was it true I had frozen family funds during some kind of misunderstanding? Was everything all right at home? All right at home? I wrote each call down. Not because I needed proof that my son was trying to frame the situation. By then, I already knew that. I wrote them down because documentation is a form of sanity when someone is trying to make you doubt your own. At 2:05, Patricia called. "Tell me what today looks like," she said. So I did. The calls, the language, the soft campaigns spreading through the family like perfume, sweet enough at first to keep people from noticing it was poison. When I finished, Patricia was silent for a beat. "Good," she said. I almost pulled the phone away from my ear. Good, yes. Not good morally, good evidentially. It means they're moving too early and too clumsily. People who are truly prepared do this with more discipline. Panic makes them sloppy. That sentence steadied me more than she probably knew. "What do I do now?" "You continue exactly as you've been doing," she said. "Document every outreach. Save voicemails if there are any. And I want you to understand something clearly, Norma. The capacity angle matters as much as the money now." I leaned back in my chair. "More than the money. In some ways, yes. A child draining a parent's accounts is ugly. But a child laying groundwork to have that parent viewed as incompetent is much more strategic. Courts, banks, doctors, social workers, once those narratives start, they can complicate everything. The truth of that made my skin prickle." Patricia continued, "I also want a fuller financial picture of Daniel." That stopped me. "Daniel, yes. Not the version he's told you. The actual one. If he's desperate enough to probe your identity and access pathways, then I want to know what's driving that desperation." I thought about all the stories Daniel had given me over the last year. Delayed payments, difficult clients, business restructuring, temporary setbacks, market conditions. Words, always words. "Where do we start?" I asked. "With what you already know," Patricia said. "Business name, lending history if you have any, prior bailouts, any documentation he ever showed you. And if Courtney has been a partner in this knowingly, I want to know when that likely began." After we hung up, I opened a fresh folder and labeled it in black ink, "Daniel Actual Financial Condition." The title alone made my stomach twist. There is something dreadful about realizing you must investigate your own child as if he were a stranger. Still, I began. I gathered old emails, text messages, a printed repayment note Daniel once scribbled and never honored. A business card from the consulting firm he had sworn was on the verge of expansion. A loan statement I had accidentally glimpsed on the hall table months earlier before it disappeared. Little pieces, fragments. But fragments tell stories when enough of them are placed side by side. And as I sorted, something started taking shape. The collapse Daniel had described as sudden did not look sudden at all. It looked prolonged. A long trail of strain. Credit extensions. Balances shifted from one place to another. Repeated urgency dressed as temporary inconvenience. One risky patch laid over another until the ground beneath it all had become soft. He had not lost his footing in a moment. He had been sinking for a long time and telling everyone he was merely stepping carefully. Courtney's role became clearer too, though, in a different way. At first I had wondered whether she had simply gone along with Daniel out of loyalty, fear, or the exhaustion of living beside a failing man. But the messages I found, the phrasing she used, the smooth confidence with which she had asked me about trusts and later life planning, the way she studied my routines, suggested something else. Maybe she had not begun the scheme, but she had joined it consciously. That realization did not surprise me the way it once might have. Courtney had always been a woman who hated instability more than she hated dishonesty. If deception seemed like the shorter bridge across a difficult river, she would walk it in clean shoes and call herself practical. Late that afternoon, as I sat at my desk with papers spread before me in neat stacks, I heard Daniel's raised voice in the hallway, not shouting at me, on the phone again. I said, "She's twisting things." A pause. "Because she is paranoid now." The word hit me harder than I expected, not because it wounded me, but because it confirmed everything. Paranoid. There it was. Not confused, not stressed, not mistaken. Paranoid. An emotional term. A mental one. A word meant to take facts and drip poison into them. I wrote it down, 4:42 p.m., overheard Daniel describe me as paranoid. When I set the pen down, my hand was perfectly steady. That steadiness frightened me a little. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so unlike the woman Daniel believed he knew. The woman who explained, smoothed over, endured. The woman who saw harm coming and translated it into something smaller so she could survive it without breaking the family. That woman was still in me somewhere, I knew that. But she was no longer in charge. By evening, I had enough to understand at least this much: Daniel had not simply made one terrible decision. He had been living dishonestly for years, and when the weight of it finally threatened to crush him, he chose the same thing he had always chosen: not accountability. A softer landing built out of someone else's sacrifice. This time me. And if I had still harbored any fantasy that Courtney was a reluctant passenger that day, ended it. She was not clinging to him in fear. She was helping him steer. As dusk deepened outside, I closed the folder and placed it beside Patricia's notes. The house was quiet again, but now it felt different. Less like I was trapped inside the storm. More like I was standing still while it circled, watching it reveal its shape. They were spreading their version. Good. Let them. Because the next time this story was told in front of family, it would not be whispers and concern and careful little seeds planted in private calls. The next time it would be facts. And facts, unlike Daniel, did not need charm to survive. The family gathering took place 3 days later at my sister Linda Mercer's house. If Daniel had chosen the location, he would have preferred somewhere more private, somewhere softer. Maybe my living room where history could be used against me. Or a restaurant where public manners might keep me quiet. But Linda had called everyone herself after enough rumors reached enough ears, and she did it in that brisk, no-nonsense way of hers that leaves very little room for refusal. Sunday, 2 o'clock. My place, she said. If there's confusion in this family, then let's clear it up in daylight. I knew exactly why Daniel agreed. He believed he still had one advantage left: emotion. He thought if he could get me in a room full of relatives, people who still remembered him as a handsome little boy in Easter shoes, people who believed mothers should always find a way to forgive, then I would soften. He thought I would cry, tremble, speak in circles, and let the weight of family history blur the hard edges of what he had done. He did not know I was bringing Patricia. Linda's house smelled like lemon oil and pot roast when I arrived. She had always kept a home that looked as though it expected company even when none was coming. Her front porch was lined with white rocking chairs. The foyer table held fresh tulips in a blue glass vase. There were framed family photographs along the hallway wall: school pictures, weddings, graduations, Christmases, from years when no one yet knew what was coming. I stood in that hallway for a second longer than I meant to, staring at one photograph of Daniel at 12, smiling with a baseball glove under one arm, his freckles darker in the summer sun. Children in pictures are dangerous things. They can make you grieve the living. Norma Linda said softly behind me. I turned. She squeezed my hand once and gave me the kind of look only a sister can give, a look that says, I know exactly how much this costs you, and I still need you to keep going. Patricia arrived 10 minutes later in a charcoal suit with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, looking less like a family guest and more like the future had put on earrings and come to collect a debt. She greeted Linda politely, nodded to me, and said in a quiet voice, "We will stay factual." It helped. The others trickled in after that. My cousin Renee, my younger nephew Scott, an aunt by marriage who always loved the phrase both sides, Linda's husband George, who mostly kept quiet but missed very little. Daniel came with Courtney, both of them dressed more carefully than usual, as if presentation alone might restore legitimacy. Courtney wore a cream blouse and pearl earrings. Daniel had chosen a navy button-down shirt that made him look younger, cleaner, more reliable. Performance begins in the mirror. Ellie was not with them. Linda had arranged for her to stay with a neighbor's granddaughter next door, under the excuse of movies and cookies and giving the adults space. I was grateful. The living room filled with the tense politeness of people who know they have entered the wrong kind of Sunday gathering. Coffee was poured. No one drank much of it. Linda finally closed the French doors to the dining room and said, "All right, enough hovering. Sit down." We did. Daniel took the armchair nearest the fireplace. Courtney sat beside him on the sofa. I sat across from them, Patricia at my right, Linda slightly behind and to the side like a witness who had no intention of letting me stand alone. For a moment no one spoke. Then Daniel did exactly what I knew he would. "Mom," he began, voice low and wounded, "I really hate that it's gotten to this. The old script. The suffering son." I said nothing. He looked around the room, spreading his hands as if to say, "See, I'm the reasonable one here. There's been a misunderstanding about finances. Things were moved around. She got alarmed. And instead of talking to me, she froze everything and brought in lawyers." He glanced at Patricia when he said the last word, like legal counsel itself were evidence of my overreaction. Renee shifted uncomfortably on the love seat. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Daniel sighed. "A cash flow issue. Temporary. I was trying to manage some obligations while things were tight." "With her accounts?" Linda asked sharply. His jaw tightened. "With family access points that were already in place." There it was again. Not my money. Family access points. Patricia made one small note on her legal pad. I folded my hands in my lap and finally spoke. "Would you like me to explain what was actually found?" Daniel looked at me and I saw it immediately, the first flash of unease. Not because I had challenged him, because my voice was steady. He had expected trembling. He got calm. Courtney leaned forward a little. "Norma, I really think we should all approach this with some compassion. Stress affects memory. It affects tone. We all may be remembering some of this differently. It was elegantly done. Not direct enough to provoke outrage from the room, but suggestive enough to plant the old poison." Patricia lifted her eyes. "No," she said. "We are not remembering this differently. We have records." The room changed at that. Tiny things shifted. Renee sat straighter. Scott stopped staring at his coffee cup. George crossed one ankle over his knee and looked at Daniel with new attention. Patricia opened her portfolio. Mrs. Ward discovered pending transfers scheduled to process from accounts solely owned by her, she said. Those transfers were not authorized by her. "We have documentation of the queued activity, altered notification pathways, and device authorizations inconsistent with proper access." Daniel gave a short, bitter laugh. "That sounds dramatic when you say it like that." Patricia did not even look at him. Facts often do. I almost admired her. Courtney spoke next, her voice softening into that polished, injured tone she liked to wear when she wanted to sound like the only adult in a room full of unstable people. "No one was stealing from Norma. Daniel was trying to hold things together. He's made mistakes, yes, but that doesn't mean there was malicious intent." "Then what was the intent?" Linda asked. Courtney turned toward her. "To protect the family." I heard George exhale through his nose, and suddenly I was tired of all of it. Tired of euphemism, tired of protect and manage and family resources and every other clean little phrase laid over something filthy. So I looked directly at my son and said, "Why were there draft inquiries about my diminished capacity?" Silence hit the room like a dropped weight. Daniel's face did not go blank this time. It hardened. Courtney spoke too quickly. "That's absurd." "No," I said. "What's absurd is pretending the money was the whole plan." Renee looked from me to Daniel in alarm. Diminished capacity, Patricia reached into her folder and removed 2 printed pages. There were exploratory communications made regarding elder care options, guardianship-related language, and informal discussions touching financial oversight in the event Mrs. Ward was no longer considered able to manage her affairs independently. Scott frowned. "You mean like declaring her incompetent?" "No one declared anyone incompetent," Daniel snapped. "But you explored it," Linda shot back. He stood up, then unable to hold the chair any longer, because somebody had to think ahead. The outburst echoed in the room. There it was. Not denial, not outrage at being falsely accused. Justification. He saw all our faces change and realized too late what he had done. "What I mean is, he began." "No," I said, and my own voice cut across his cleanly. "What you mean is exactly what you said." He stared at me. I went on because if I stopped, then I might never start again. "You didn't just try to move money, Daniel. You studied me. You corrected me in front of people when I wasn't wrong. You used my age as if it were evidence. You let your wife ask questions about trusts and care and legal control as if she were being helpful. And all the while you were building a story where I would become the problem standing in the way of your rescue." Courtney's eyes flashed. "That is not fair." I turned to her. "What is unfair is making a child listen to grown adults plan around her grandmother like she's furniture." That hit, not just because it was true, because Courtney knew I meant Ellie. Her mouth parted slightly, then closed. Renee whispered. Ellie heard this. I did not answer that directly. I would not drag that child further into the room than necessary. Instead, I said, enough was overheard to confirm more than I ever wanted confirmed. Daniel's face changed again, then rage first, then something more desperate beneath it. This is unbelievable, he said. After everything I've been carrying, after the business collapse, after trying to keep my family afloat, you stand there making me sound like a criminal. I looked at him for a long moment. It is a terrible thing to see a grown man still trying to use hardship as a permission slip. You made yourself sound that way, I said quietly. I simply stopped protecting you from the echo. No one moved. Not one person in that room rushed to defend him. That more than anything seemed to unnerve Daniel. He had spent his whole life relying on emotional momentum, on being the first to cry, the first to explain, the first to cast himself as wounded enough that people would lower their standards. But facts are slow, heavy things. Once laid out, they make performance look very small. Aunt Marjorie, who had barely spoken all afternoon, finally cleared her throat and said the one thing I knew someone eventually would. He is still your son, Norma. I turned toward her. The sentence entered the room carrying generations behind it. Obligation, blood, endurance, the sacred duty of mothers to absorb what others cannot. And because of that, my answer had to be exact. Yes, I said. He is. And that is why this hurts the way it does. But being my son is the reason this wound is so deep. It is not the reason he should escape the truth. Marjorie lowered her eyes. Linda let out a slow breath, and I knew she had been waiting to see whether I would say it that plainly. Daniel laughed once, a broken, angry sound with no humor in it. So that's it, he said. You turn your whole family against me. I felt something inside me settle then. Not triumph, not relief, just certainty. No, I said. You did that the moment you decided I was too old to notice what you were doing. He looked as though I had struck him. Maybe in a way I had. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different from before. Not tense. Resolved. The truth had entered and sat down. And for the first time since this nightmare began, no one could pretend not to see it. After the gathering at Linda's house, something in Daniel broke loose. Not the way a person breaks when shame finally reaches the heart. I wish I could say that. I wish I could tell you that being exposed in front of family softened him, humbled him, forced him to see himself clearly. But that is not what happened. What happened was uglier. When people like Daniel lose control in public, they often come looking for private ground where they think they can still win. Family history becomes that ground. Old guilt, old loyalties, the things they think still belong to them because they have worked before. He and Courtney came back to my house just before sunset to collect more of their things. The drive from Linda's had been silent, or so I assumed, because by the time they stepped through my front door, both of them looked too polished in the face, too tight around the mouth, like two people holding themselves together with spite. I was standing in the foyer when they entered. No television on, no dinner started, no softness left in the room. Courtney carried her purse and car keys like she intended to move briskly, cleanly, as if speed itself might keep the situation from feeling like what it was. Daniel shut the door harder than necessary behind them and stood there for a moment with his hand still on the knob, breathing through his nose. Neither of them spoke first. That silence told me more than shouting could have. They had come in with a strategy. They were deciding which version to try. Finally, Daniel looked at me and said, "You embarrassed me." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "We need to talk." Not, "How do we fix this?" You embarrassed me. I folded my arms loosely over my waist, more to hold myself upright than to defend anything. No, Daniel, the truth embarrassed you. His jaw tightened. You didn't have to do it like that. Like what? In front of everyone. I almost laughed, but it would have sounded too bitter. In front of everyone, I repeated. The way you and Courtney planned my future without me, the way you rehearsed my decline in front of your daughter, the way you used my age in quiet little pieces until you thought the room would already believe I was slipping. If you ever needed it to. He stepped toward me then, not enough to frighten me physically, but enough to show me that the polished sun from Linda's living room was gone. Don't do that, he snapped. Don't act like you're the only one who suffered here. There it was again. Suffered. As if hardship itself absolved character. Courtney set her purse down on the entry table and spoke in a low, strained voice. Daniel. He ignored her. For months, he said, I've been carrying everything. Bill's pressure, trying to figure out how to keep my family from drowning, and all you can see is yourself. Something in me went very still. All you can see is yourself. There are sentences so inverted, so shameless in their rearrangement of truth, that they have a clarifying effect. They strip away the last lingering hope that you are dealing with misunderstanding instead of entitlement. I opened my house to you, I said. I paid your bills. I protected your daughter from your instability. I gave you time, money, privacy, and excuse after excuse, and you stand in my foyer telling me I only see myself. He ran a hand through his hair and turned away as if I were exhausting him. That's exactly what I mean. Everything is always your sacrifice, your grief, your house, your money. Do you ever think about what it feels like to be the one everyone expects to fail? The cruelty of that almost took my breath away, because he had just told the truth without meaning to. That was what all of this had been about. Not survival. Not temporary panic. Humiliation. He could not bear being the one who had failed, so he had tried to reposition me as the weaker figure. If I became old, confused, difficult, fragile, if I became the story, then he would not have to be. Courtney spoke again, sharper this time. Daniel, stop. He rounded on her. No, you stop. You wanted me to fix this. Her face went pale. Not like this. I watched them then, not as my son and daughter-in-law, but as two people at the edge of a collapsing alliance. It struck me suddenly that greed does not bond people nearly as well as comfort does. The moment comfort disappears, the cracks show fast. Daniel turned back to me, his voice lower now, almost cold. You know what? Maybe Dad would be ashamed of you. I will not pretend that sentence did not hurt. It did. It hit me in the oldest part of myself, the place where Frank still lived, not as memory but as moral witness. For a second, grief rose so quickly in me I had to dig my nails into my palm to stay anchored. But then just as quickly came something else. Clarity. Frank had prepared me for paperwork, for widowhood, for the ugly mechanics of survival. He had trusted me with structure because he knew exactly who I was. Daniel had spent months trying to turn that same woman into an object of control. So no, Frank would not have been ashamed of me. He would have recognized the necessity of what came next. Don't use your father to cover your own choices, I said. Daniel's eyes flashed. You think this makes you strong. No, I said. I think it makes me late. That landed. He opened his mouth, then shut it. I went on. I should have stopped protecting you from consequence years ago. I should have stopped translating your selfishness into pain I could solve. I should have recognized sooner that you had learned to treat my love as a guarantee. Courtney looked away. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. There it is. The speech. This isn't a speech, I said. It's the end of a pattern. Silence fell between us again, but now it was different. Less like a confrontation, more like a verdict approaching. Then Daniel said the sentence that finally cut the last thread. Maybe you really are too old to be living alone if this is how you handle simple trust. For a moment, the whole house seemed to go quiet around those words. Not just the foyer, everything. The kitchen beyond it, the hallway, the stairs, the grandfather clock in the den. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to disappear, because there it was at last. Not implied, not disguised, too old, living alone, simple trust. The sentence carried every piece of the plan inside it, the disrespect, the manipulation, the contempt, the assumption that my age made me available for rearrangement. I looked at my son, and in that instant I felt something close inside me, not love, not forever, not even forgiveness, but access. The open, bleeding access he had enjoyed to my conscience for years. You need to leave my house, I said. Courtney's head snapped toward me. Norma, no! I held up one hand and my voice did not rise. You both need to leave my house. Daniel stared at me as if he truly believed I could not say such a thing and mean it. You can't be serious. I have never been more serious in my life. He stepped forward half a pace. You would throw your own son out, I met his eyes. You stopped standing here as my son when you decided I was easier to erase than to respect. Courtney began crying then, but not in the way I might once have responded to. No trembling collapse, no real surrender. It was the cry of a woman who sees a structure falling and still hopes tears might delay the moment the roof comes down. Norma, please, she said. Just give us a little time. We need to think. We need to figure out where to go. Ellie. At Ellie's name, my chest tightened. That was the only part of this that still had the power to shake me. But I did not waver. Ellie will not be caught in another one of your whispered strategies, I said. She needs stability, and she is not getting it from this house while you are in it. Courtney wiped under one eye. What does that even mean? It means I said that until legal arrangements and living arrangements are clear, you will communicate through Patricia, not through me, not in my kitchen, not at my bedroom door, through counsel. Daniel scoffed. You really think you can lawyer your way out of being a mother? That sentence would once have destroyed me. That night it only saddened me, because he still thought motherhood meant, I think I can finally mother myself the way I should have years ago. He looked genuinely startled by that. Courtney sank onto the bench by the door and covered part of her face with one hand. Daniel began pacing the foyer in short, furious turns, like a man searching for some version of the room in which he still held power. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. I told them they could return the next day during specific hours to collect what they needed, that Linda had agreed to have Ellie stay with her temporarily if necessary, and that any discussion of finances, property, or future arrangements would go through Patricia Holloway's office. I said it all calmly, clearly. Once. Daniel tried 3 more tactics before the night was over. Anger, guilt, disbelief, none of them worked. At one point, he stood at the bottom of the stairs holding a duffel bag and looked at me with such naked hatred that I almost did not recognize him. And yet what I felt then was not fear. It was mourning. Not for the man in front of me, for the years behind him, for every moment I had mistaken enabling for love, for every soft place I had laid down that he had learned to walk across without gratitude. By the time the front door closed behind them, the house felt hollow. Not lighter. Not yet. Just hollow. The kind of hollow that comes after an amputation when pain is mixed with relief, and the body has not yet learned how to understand what is no longer attached to it. I stood in the entryway for a long time after they were gone, one hand resting on the wall, listening to the deep quiet that followed. Then I locked the door, and for the first time in longer than I could bear to admit, the sound of that lock felt like love. Justice, I discovered, does not arrive with music. It does not sweep through the wreckage of your life and make everything look purposeful. It does not hand you peace in the same hour it hands someone else consequences. When Daniel and Courtney were finally out of my house, I thought I might feel relief so powerful it would lift me off the ground. What I felt instead was tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of age or a bad night's sleep, a deeper kind. The kind that settles into bone after shock has done its work and left you standing in the aftermath with forms to sign people, to call drawers to reorganize, rooms to reclaim, and emotions arriving in the wrong order. The first week after they left passed in a blur of practicalities. Patricia moved quickly. The fraud review widened. Raymond helped me formalize long-term banking protections and separate every vulnerable structure that should have been dismantled years earlier. My passwords changed. Authentication methods were rebuilt from the ground up. Credit monitoring stayed active. Formal notices went out. There were calls I had to answer and others I no longer did. Patricia insisted that all contact from Daniel or Courtney come through her office unless it concerned Ellie's immediate welfare. At first, I was grateful for the barrier. Then I realized how much it hurt that one was necessary. The legal side of things did not turn theatrical. No detectives appeared on my porch. No handcuffs snapped in front of the neighbors. Real consequences are often less dramatic and more humiliating than people imagine. Daniel's financial lies began surfacing not in one grand collapse, but in document after document. Unpaid obligations, restructured balances, delinquent accounts disguised for months by temporary fixes and borrowed time. The business he had described as recovering was not recovering at all. It had been bleeding quietly for much longer than he admitted, and he had layered denial over debt until even he seemed to believe momentum might replace discipline. Courtney, for her part, did what people like Courtney often do when the boat starts taking on water. She shifted her weight. At first, she stayed aligned with him in tone, if not in spirit. Patricia relayed careful messages from their side about miscommunication, stress-based decisions, and family healing. But very quickly the language changed. Daniel had acted rashly. Daniel had failed to tell her certain things. Daniel had created impossible pressure. Daniel had left her scrambling. I was not naive enough to believe she had suddenly found morality. She had found self-preservation. Still, even that carried its own sadness. For all their whispering, scheming, and carefully built little world of excuses, greed had not made them loyal to each other. It had only made them useful to each other until usefulness ran out. Their marriage began cracking almost immediately. Not in a way I watched directly, but in the fragments that reached me through Patricia, through Linda, through the peculiar grapevine of extended family that can smell collapse from 3 zip codes away. Courtney was staying some nights with a friend. Daniel was sleeping in a short-term rental farther out of town than he liked. There were arguments over money blame and Ellie's schedule. Words like separation and counseling began circling before either of them had the dignity to say them aloud. And through all of it, I did not feel victorious. I need to say that plainly because stories like this tempt people toward a cleaner ending than life usually offers. There was justice, yes, but justice did not taste sweet. Not right away. It tasted like paperwork and silence and learning how to walk through my own kitchen without bracing for tension. My house felt enormous after they left. For the first 2 mornings, I woke before dawn the way I had during the worst of it, listening for footsteps upstairs that no longer came. I would lie there in the dark with my hand on my chest, waiting for the old dread to rise, and when it did not, I almost missed it out of habit. Trauma teaches the body routines before the mind agrees to them. The guest room still smelled faintly of Courtney's perfume for a while. One drawer in the bathroom held an eyeliner pencil she had forgotten. Daniel's old coffee travel mug turned up behind a kitchen canister days after I thought I had cleared everything. These tiny remnants unnerved me more than I expected. Not because I wanted them there, because they reminded me how completely people can invade your space before you finally understand you are being crowded out of it. Little by little, I began putting the house back in order. Not cleaning exactly, reclaiming. I stripped the guest bed and opened the windows wide. I boxed the few items they had left and stored them for Patricia to handle. I rearranged the pantry because Courtney had redone it in one of her helpful moods months earlier, and I realized with surprising fury that I wanted my canned soup and baking flour back where I had always kept them. I moved a chair in the den 2 inches to the left simply because Frank had liked it there, and Daniel had once shoved it aside with his foot to make room for a laptop charger. These were small acts. But small acts are how dignity returns. On the 4th day, I made coffee and drank it alone on the back patio for the first time in over a year. The morning was cool. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and turned soil. Somewhere, 2 houses down, a lawnmower started up. I sat with both hands wrapped around the mug and listened to ordinary life proceed without crisis, needing to be managed around it. I realized then how long I had been living in reaction. To Daniel's moods, to Courtney's questions, to the strain in the house, to the tiny humiliations I kept pretending were nothing. Even before I knew the full shape of the danger, my body had known enough to stay braced. Now there was only birdsong coffee and my own breath, and I cried, not because I missed them. Not exactly. I cried because peace had become unfamiliar enough to surprise me. That same week, I went back to church for the first time in a month. I almost didn't. I dreaded the looks, the careful sympathy, the possibility that someone had heard some crooked version of the story before the truth fully settled in. But staying home felt too much like hiding, and I had done enough of that. So I wore a navy cardigan pearls Frank had given me on our 25th anniversary and drove myself there with both hands steady on the wheel. 3 women from my Bible study met me at the fellowship hall door as if they had been waiting to make sure I didn't have to walk in alone. None of them asked invasive questions. None of them leaned in hungrily for scandal. One hugged me. One touched my arm. One simply said, "It's good to see you." Sometimes kindness is just the refusal to make another woman explain her wounds before she's ready. After the service, I stood near the coffee urn and let myself be ordinary for 20 minutes. I spoke about the weather, about daffodils, about a neighbor's knee surgery. It felt almost holy, that small return to a world in which I was not only the mother of a son who had betrayed me, I was still Norma. That mattered more than I can say. Ellie began visiting the following weekend. At first, the arrangements were cautious. Patricia preferred everything be clearly documented, and Linda helped create a rhythm that felt stable rather than improvised. Ellie spent Saturday afternoons with me, sometimes into Sunday lunch, depending on what was happening between her parents. She arrived carrying more than an overnight bag ever should: school books, a sketch pad, a reluctance to speak too freely, and the constant low-grade vigilance children develop when the adults around them are no longer trustworthy. I did not push her. We baked banana bread one Saturday and barely spoke for an hour except to measure flour and argue gently over how many walnuts counted as enough. Another afternoon, we planted herbs in clay pots for the kitchen window. She was quiet through most of it, but it was a different quiet from before. Less frightened, more resting. Then on a Sunday evening, while we folded towels together in the laundry room, she said something that stopped me. "Grandma, yes, sweetheart." She matched 2 washcloths, then looked down at them as she spoke. "I used to think getting old meant people stop listening to you." The sentence was so simple, so devastating that for a moment I could only stare at her. She went on before I answered. "Like, they still love you maybe, but they don't think you really know things anymore." I leaned against the dryer and looked at her carefully. "Why did you think that?" She shrugged, but her face had gone pink. "Because of how Mom and Dad talk sometimes. And because people always say, old people need help, even when you didn't." There was no self-pity in the way she said it, just observation, and that made it sadder. I crossed the room and took the towels from her hands, setting them aside. Then I cupped her face gently and said, "Listen to me. Growing older does not mean becoming less real. It does not mean becoming less smart. And it certainly does not mean someone else gets to take over your life because they are louder." She blinked up at me. I smiled, though my throat was tight. Sometimes age means the exact opposite. Sometimes it means you finally know which doors should stay open and which ones need to be shut and locked. A tiny smile touched her mouth then. I kissed her forehead. That night, after Linda picked her up, I stood alone in the quiet laundry room with a half-folded stack of towels and let that conversation settle inside me. Justice had not made me happy. Not yet. But it had made something else possible. Space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space for one little girl to begin learning that strength and age are not enemies. Space for me to become more than the wound my son left behind. The loneliness was still there. Of course it was. Some evenings the house felt too still, and the ache of what Daniel had become would rise in me without warning. There were moments when I wanted to call Frank so badly it physically hurt. Moments when I wondered whether Justice was always meant to feel this sad. But underneath the sadness, something gentler had begun. Not triumph, not even forgiveness. Just the first thin roots of peace pushing quietly back into the life that had almost been taken from me. Daniel came to see me on a Thursday afternoon in late April, just as the dogwoods had begun to bloom. I had not expected him that day. Patricia had told me there might eventually be a request for a direct conversation, but she advised against agreeing too soon, and for once in my life, I had listened to caution before guilt. Weeks had passed since the gathering at Linda's house. Enough time for the first heat of public humiliation to cool. Enough time for paperwork to harden into reality. Enough time, apparently, for my son to discover that silence does not automatically become forgiveness just because it lasts long enough. I was in the kitchen slicing strawberries for myself when I saw his truck pull into the driveway. My first feeling was not fear. It was fatigue. There are some people whose presence still exhausts you even after they have left your home because your body remembers how much work it once took to brace around them. I stood there with the knife in my hand, looking through the window above the sink as Daniel sat behind the wheel for a few extra seconds before getting out. He looked older, not dramatically. Not in the theatrical way grief ages people in movies, but the polish was gone. His shoulders seemed heavier. His shirt was wrinkled like he had pulled it from a chair instead of a hanger. The handsome self-assurance that used to arrive before him like cologne had thinned into something frayed. I set the knife down, wiped my hands on a dish towel, and went to the front door. I did not open it right away. Through the narrow glass panel beside it, I could see him standing on the porch, one hand in his pocket, the other hanging loose by his side. He looked uncertain in a way I had not seen since he was young. Then I unlocked the door and opened it only part way. "Why are you here?" The bluntness of my own voice surprised even me. Daniel looked at my face, then past my shoulder into the hallway, as if memory itself had opened the door with me. "I just want to talk. We've done a great deal of talking. I mean really talk." I almost said no immediately. But something in his face stopped me, not trust, not hope, not even softness, just the weary knowledge that sometimes refusing a conversation does not end it. It only moves it into a different shape inside you. So I stepped back. 10 minutes. He came in slowly, like a man entering a church he had once mocked. The house was quiet. No television. No extra dishes in the sink. No tension moving room to room like secondhand smoke. He noticed it too. I could tell by the way his eyes moved. The den, the stairs, the kitchen, the windows opened just enough to let spring air in. "This place feels different," he said. "It is." I did not offer him coffee. I did not ask him to sit in the den where Frank's photograph watched over too much of my life. Instead, I led him to the kitchen table where so much of our destruction had unfolded that it seemed only fitting whatever honesty remained should happen there. He sat. I remained standing for a moment, then took the chair across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked down at his hands and said, "Courtney moved out." I had known they were separating in everything but name. Patricia had mentioned as much in careful terms. Still, hearing him say it aloud made it sound smaller, sadder, more human. "For good?" I asked. "I think so." I waited. He rubbed both palms over his thighs once as if trying to wake his own body up. "She says, I dragged her into this. And did you?" His mouth twitched in something like bitterness. "Not all at once." That answer, imperfect as it was, landed closer to truth than most things he had said in months. I studied him. People often imagine a reckoning arrives with clean confession. In my experience, it almost never does. Shame leaks. It circles. It says one honest thing and then retreats behind defense before coming out again from another angle. Daniel cleared his throat. "I know I messed up." I said nothing. He looked up then, perhaps hoping silence would count as softness. When it didn't, he continued, "No, that's not enough. I know I did worse than mess up." Still, I said nothing. His eyes dropped again. "I've had too much time to think lately," he said, and gave a short, humorless laugh. "Turns out people don't line up to rescue you once they realize you've been lying. There was truth in that too. Not noble truth. Not transformed man truth. But truth. What do you want from me, Daniel?" He flinched slightly at the question, maybe because he had come without a fully formed answer, maybe because the old answers no longer worked. "I don't know," he said finally. Maybe I just wanted you to hear me. I heard you very clearly the first time." His face tightened. "I know." Outside, a breeze moved the wind chime on the back patio, and the soft, clinking sound entered the pause between us. Daniel looked toward the window, then back at me. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I almost said yes. There were so many candidates. But I let him speak. "The worst part is that I kept telling myself I was going to fix it before it got that far." His voice had gone lower now. Less defensive. More tired. Every bad thing was supposed to be temporary. Every loan, every lie, every time I moved something around. I kept thinking I was one deal away from making it all look reasonable. There it was, the architecture of self-deception. Not evil announced cleanly. Evil rationalized one panic at a time until it looked from the inside like delayed correction. And when that stopped working, I asked. He swallowed. I got desperate. I leaned back in my chair. Desperate. It was the word people always used when they wanted to drag desperation into the room like a witness for the defense. As if fear of consequences could somehow soften the shape of the choices made to avoid them. But I let him continue. I didn't start out trying to... He stopped. Began again. "I didn't think about it in terms of taking your life over." "No," I said quietly. He looked pained. "Not at first." The words sat between us. "Not at first." There is a special kind of ache in hearing that the line was crossed gradually because it means there were moments, many of them perhaps, where a better choice still existed and was consciously passed over. "So when did you start?" I asked. He covered his mouth with one hand for a second, then dragged it downward. "I think when I realized you were still stronger than I needed you to be." The sentence hit me harder than any apology could have. Not because I hadn't understood something like it already. I had. But hearing him say it so plainly pulled the last veil off. "You needed me weaker," I said. He shook his head too fast. "That sounds true." He closed his eyes. Tears did not come. Not then. What came instead was the expression of a man whose excuses had thinned to the point where they no longer fully protected him. "I thought..." He stopped again. "I thought you would never fight me." There it was. The ugliest truth of all. Not the money, Not the accounts, not even the draft language around capacity. He believed my love made me safe to exploit. For a moment the kitchen blurred. Not with tears exactly, but with the sudden pressure of old years rearranging themselves in my mind. All the times I had helped, covered, excused, explained, loved him in ways that softened the edges of his failures before he ever had to feel them properly. Somewhere inside, all that he had learned a lesson I never meant to teach. My love was not a gift in his mind. It was a guarantee. When I spoke, my voice was steady, but I could feel the pain under it like a second current. You mistook mercy for weakness. He looked at me, and finally some part of him seemed to understand that this was not a line from a confrontation. It was a diagnosis. Yes, he said. I nodded once. The honesty of that answer did not heal anything, but it mattered. For a while we sat in silence. Then Daniel asked, "Do you hate me?" It was such a child's question in a grown man's mouth that it nearly broke me. "No," I said. He looked almost relieved too quickly, and I saw it happen, the old reflex, the hope that love might yet be turned into a bridge back over the damage. So I continued, "But I do not trust you, and I will not rescue you." That landed the way truth often does, when no softness is left around it. He looked down at the table. "I'm in therapy," he said after a moment. I had not expected that. "Are you?" "Yes." I waited. He gave a short shrug. At first, because Patricia made it sound like everything would go worse for me if I didn't start acting like a responsible adult. That sounded like Patricia. "Now?" I asked. His voice changed slightly then. Less performance, more confusion. Now, because I don't like who I hear when I explain myself out loud, I believed that more than I expected to. Not fully. Not with the kind of trust that opens doors. But enough to recognize that collapse sometimes reveals a person to himself in ways success never does. I folded my hands on the table. Accountability is not saying you're sorry because your plan failed. He nodded faintly. It is not blaming pressure, Courtney, your business or me. Another nod. It is not asking me to make this easier because the consequences finally feel real. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I went on. If there is any path forward for you at all, Daniel, it will not come through me carrying what belongs on your back. It will come through truth, therapy, documentation, restitution where required, and years of behaving like a man who understands what he did. At that, his eyes finally filled. He looked away, embarrassed by it, but not fast enough to hide it from me. "I don't know if I can fix this," he said. "You can't," I answered. He looked back, startled. "What you broke will never become what it was before. That is gone." The tears spilled then, though only 2 of them, and he wiped them away angrily as if betrayed by his own face. I did not move to comfort him. That may sound harsh, perhaps it is. But there are times when comfort becomes theft too, when offering it too early steals consequence before it finishes teaching what it came to teach. After a while he stood. I stood too. At the door he hesitated. "I did love you," he said quietly. "I mean, I do." The sentence might once have been enough to unravel me. Now I only looked at him and said, "Then learn the difference between love and entitlement." He closed his eyes for 1 second, nodded, and stepped out onto the porch. I watched him walk to his truck beneath the white bloom of the dogwood tree Frank had planted the year Daniel turned 10. He moved more slowly than he used to, as if life had finally become something he could no longer charm into carrying him. When he drove away, I closed the door and rested my hand against it for a moment. I was shaking then, not with regret, with sorrow, because mercy with boundaries still hurts, perhaps more than mercy without them. It asks you to remain human without returning to surrender. I stood there until the trembling passed. Then I went back into my kitchen, rinsed the strawberries I had left unfinished, and finished preparing my own afternoon exactly the way I wanted it. That was the only rescue I had left to offer, and this time it belonged to me. By the end of summer, my house belonged to me again. I do not mean legally. It had always belonged to me on paper. I mean in the quieter, more sacred sense. The air had changed. The walls no longer seemed to listen for conflict. The rooms no longer carried that strange, strained feeling that comes when people are living inside a lie and expecting you to adapt yourself around it. The first few months after Daniel left were about survival, protection, and exhaustion. But somewhere between late spring and the end of August, survival began turning into something steadier. deliberate life. I started with the practical things because practical things had always been my way back to myself. Patricia helped me revise every legal structure that needed tightening. My estate documents were rewritten with clarity that left no room for assumption, manipulation, or sentimental confusion. Access protocols were updated. Power of attorney language was reviewed and carefully limited. Beneficiary structures were examined line by line. The house deed, investment accounts, medical directives, everything that could one day become unclear in the hands of the wrong person was made painfully, beautifully clear. There is dignity and specificity. For years, I had thought love required softness around the edges. What I learned instead is that love sometimes requires exact language and locked drawers. The most important decision I made in those months involved Ellie. I did not want anything meant for that child's future to pass through adult hands capable of treating her security like an opportunity. So, with Patricia's help and Raymond's guidance, I established a protected educational fund for her, structured in a way that no parent, no spouse, no desperate story, no emotional appeal could misuse it. It was not extravagant. That was never the point. It was steady, protected, real. When Patricia slid the final paperwork across the desk for my signature, I held the pen for a second longer than usual. "This one matters," I said. Patricia gave me that small, rare, almost smile of hers. "I know." I signed my name slowly, not as a woman reacting to danger, as a woman deciding what safety would look like after it. Ellie did not know every detail, of course. She was still a child, and there are burdens grown women should carry so girls do not have to. But she knew enough to understand that her future was being protected in a way that did not depend on anybody's mood. The first time I told her she would always be able to go to school without having to wonder which adult crisis might swallow the money first, she looked at me in that direct, solemn way of hers and said, "So it's really mine for school?" "Yes," I said. "No one can move it around," I swallowed once before answering. "No one." She nodded, and for a moment her face stayed very still. Then she smiled, not wildly, not like a child in a commercial, but with the quiet relief of someone who had learned too early that promises can shift shape overnight. That smile was worth more to me than any revenge could ever have been. The house itself took longer. You can update documents in an afternoon. Reclaiming a home is slower. I did it room by room. The guest room was first. I repainted it a soft green I had always liked but never chosen because Daniel once said it made the room look old-fashioned. I smiled bitterly when I thought of that and bought the paint anyway. I replaced the curtains. I changed the bedding. I moved out every last trace of the people who had lived there under the shelter of my generosity and mistaken it for surrender. The den came next. I put Frank's chair back where it had originally belonged before years of convenience and other people's habits had pushed it aside. I had one of his old jazz records professionally cleaned and played it on a Sunday afternoon with all the windows open. The sound filled the house in a way that made me stand still in the hallway and cry, but not from pain this time. From recognition. There you are, I thought. Not to Frank. To myself. The kitchen took the longest because that was where the worst of it had happened. The whispers, the glances, the breakfast when Daniel first looked at me not like a son but like a man discovering resistance. For a while I could not sit at the table without feeling some shadow of that morning return, so I changed what I could. Not because I was erasing what happened, but because I refused to let betrayal become the dominant memory of the room. I bought a new runner for the center of the table. I moved the fruit bowl. I hung a different set of curtains with a small blue pattern Frank would have teased me for calling cheerful. I invited Linda over one Saturday for chicken salad and iced tea, and we laughed so hard over some long-forgotten story about our mother's disastrous attempt at home perms in 1978 that for the first time in months the kitchen sounded like family without danger inside it. Healing, I discovered, is often embarrassingly domestic. A clean drawer, fresh paint, a table used for laughter instead of strategy. By early fall, I was sleeping through most nights again. Not every night. Some evenings grief still came in sideways. A memory of Daniel as a little boy would rise without warning, mud on his sneakers, a Halloween costume, his hand in Frank's, and I would have to sit very still with the knowledge that love and disappointment can live in the same body, without canceling each other. That was one of the hardest lessons of all. I did not stop loving my son. What I stopped doing was offering that love in forms he could weaponize. There were updates, of course. Patricia kept me informed where necessary. Daniel remained in therapy. The legal consequences did not evaporate, though they unfolded more through restitution, restrictions, documentation, and reputational damage than through anything theatrical. Courtney moved into a smaller apartment. Their marriage did not survive in any meaningful sense, though the paperwork took time to catch up to the truth. Ellie continued dividing her time carefully with more structure now and fewer whispered scenes. And me, I became a woman I had perhaps been building toward all along, though I did not recognize her until everything false was stripped away. I joined a small weekday walking group from church. I started going back to the public library twice a month just because I liked the smell of books and quiet air conditioning. I planted rosemary and basil outside the kitchen window and learned that both grow better when you stop fussing over them every day. I said no more often, and I noticed how rarely the sky fell when I did. One evening in October, I sat on the porch at dusk with a blanket over my knees and watched the light drain out of the yard in long gold ribbons. The dogwood tree Frank planted all those years ago had gone bare again. The air carried that first thin bite of autumn. Somewhere down the street, children were laughing. A car door slammed. Someone's wind chime answered the breeze. I thought then about the woman I had been on that night in the hallway, holding a glass of water while my son told his wife I was too old to care. He had been wrong, not only about my awareness, about age itself. Age had not made me weaker. It had made me slower to deny what I knew. It had given me memory, pattern recognition, patience, and eventually the strength to stop translating disrespect into something more bearable. The real danger had never been my age. It had been my unwillingness to imagine that someone I loved could mistake my kindness for permission. Once I accepted that truth, everything changed. And the deepest victory I came to understand was not that Daniel lost access to money. It was that I regained access to myself. Months later, Ellie spent the night and asked if we could sleep in the den like a campout with blankets and one old movie and popcorn in bowls too big for 2 people. We did. Halfway through the movie, she fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, and I sat there in the low flicker of the television listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. The house was quiet. Not tense, quiet. Not waiting, quiet. Peaceful quiet. The kind that does not ask anything of you. I looked around the room at Frank's chair at the lamp. I had switched back to the warm bulb he preferred, at the folded quilt on the ottoman, at the little sleeping face beside me, and I understood something so simple it almost felt holy. Home is not where no one has ever hurt you. Home is where harm no longer gets the final word. That night, after I covered Ellie with an extra blanket and turned off the television, I walked through the dark house checking the locks the way I always do. Front door, back door, patio, everything secure, familiar, mine. Then I went to my bedroom, slid beneath the covers, and lay there in the dark with my hands resting lightly over the quilt. No footsteps overhead. No whispers through walls. No dread waiting for morning. Just stillness. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time since Frank died, I did not feel like I was holding my breath inside my own life. I closed my eyes, and I slept all the way through the night. Some of the deepest betrayals in life do not come from strangers. They come from the people we once prayed for, sacrificed for, and loved so completely that we never imagined they could use that love against us. But this story is a reminder that growing older does not mean becoming powerless. It does not mean your voice matters less, your instincts matter less, or your dignity can be negotiated away for the comfort of someone else. Sometimes age gives us the very thing youth cannot: clarity. The clarity to see patterns we once excused. The clarity to stop confusing love with permission. And the clarity to understand that protecting yourself is not cruelty, it is wisdom. Norma's journey teaches something many women spend a lifetime learning. Being a mother does not mean being available for endless emotional theft. Love is holy, but love without boundaries can become the very door that allows harm to enter. There is no shame in finally closing that door. There is no shame in saying, "You may be my family, but you do not get to destroy my peace." In fact, there is courage in it. Real courage. The kind that doesn't scream but stands firm. The kind that grieves and still chooses truth. The kind that hurts deeply yet still makes room for healing. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all. Justice is not always loud and healing is not always dramatic. Sometimes healing is a quiet house, a locked door, a safe grandchild, a table where fear no longer sits, and a woman who can finally sleep at night because she has stopped abandoning herself to keep others comfortable. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what stayed with you the most. Have you ever had to set a painful boundary with someone you loved? I would truly love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, stories about strength, dignity, family betrayal, and healing, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Your voice matters, and I'd love to hear it.